Ah, the Edwardian era. That glittering moment between corsets and catastrophe, where tea was eternal, manners were mandatory, and appearances were everything. If you wanted to survive high society in the early 1900s, you didn't just need charm or intelligence, you needed cheekbones sharp enough to slice bread. It was an age powered by contradictions, progress and peril, refinement and repression, lace powder. And somewhere between Queen Victoria's funeral procession and the first taxicabs of London, the Edwardians developed a collective obsession, not with morality, not with invention, but with beauty. A dangerous one. Before this, beauty had always been admired, sure. The Tudors painted it, the Georgians powdered it, and the Victorians moralised it. But the Edwardians, they commodified it. Beauty stopped being a divine gift and became a social currency. It was traded in glances, polished in mirrors, and, if you could afford it, reshaped with scalpels. This was the first time in history that modern beauty's standards really started to standardise. Photographs and glossy illustrations were everywhere. Magazines like The Ladies' Realm and Harper's Bazaar told women exactly how they should look. Spoiler, it was never like you currently do. There were entire columns advising women how to look less tired, which is a polite Edwardian way of saying you look like yesterday's wallpaper paste. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Industrialisation, of course, made things worse. Factories didn't just churn out steam and smoke, they churned out self-awareness. The middle class was growing, urban life was expanding, and with it came mirrors. Yes, mirrors. Now mass-produced and suddenly affordable enough for ordinary people to see their own faces more than once a week. Humanity collectively went, "Oh no, is that what I look like?" And society's self-esteem has never recovered. For women especially, beauty was no longer a private pleasure. It was a professional necessity. Marriage markets, social introductions, and even employment often hinged on how well you could present yourself. The Edwardian woman was expected to radiate delicate vitality, a glowing health that came from daily walks, good breeding, and absolutely no signs of stress, despite living in a world that ran entirely on stress. And if you think men were immune to this, oh no, the Edwardian gentleman might not have worn rouge, but he certainly trimmed his moustache with a sense of destiny. Looking distinguished was practically a tax requirement. A crooked nose could cost you a promotion, a bald spot could threaten your political career. Appearance wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Meanwhile, science began whispering seductive promises. The same modernity that brought the telephone and the motor car also brought new chemicals, medical tools, and surgical techniques. And because humans never met a sharp instrument they didn't eventually apply to themselves, cosmetic surgery was born badly. Beauty salons began multiplying across London like ambitious mushrooms. Most advertised gentle treatments, facial massage, skin tonics, or electrical rejuvenation. But beneath the respectable signage lurked a darker side, unregulated practitioners offering to refine your features in backrooms that smelled faintly of chloroform and regret. Magazines, of course, helped fan the flames. They published breathless testimonials. I removed 10 years from my face in one afternoon. No mention of how many weeks it took for the swelling to go down. They sold creams that tightened the skin and tonics that purified the blood. The ingredients list read like a chemistry exam gone wrong. Lead, mercury, arsenic. But at least you'd die looking luminous. Beauty for the Edwardians became a moral performance. Looking young meant you were virtuous, disciplined, and civilized. Looking tired meant you were lazy, morally questionable, or worse, poor. The entire empire seemed to run on the fear of appearing unpresentable. The good news? You were alive. The bad news? Everyone could now see you clearly. But perhaps the most dangerous part of this new obsession wasn't the arsenic creams or the scalpels. It was the expectation. The Edwardian woman, raised to be ornamental yet intelligent, was now told that her worth could be measured in centimetres of waistline and smoothness of complexion. Even actresses and socialites, those who seemed to embody effortless beauty, were quietly undergoing painful corrections. Cosmetic surgery wasn't a public trend yet. It was a whispered secret, an unspoken agreement between shame and aspiration. Women disappeared for rest cures and returned with suspiciously lifted eyelids. Gentlemen claimed sinus operations that somehow straightened their noses. Society noticed but didn't comment. It was rude to ask, but impossible not to wonder. And while the world was busy perfecting its external image, the internal rot of pressure and insecurity grew unchecked. The Edwardians, ever obsessed with control and refinement, tried to discipline their bodies the same way they disciplined their manners, with precision and pain. So there it began, the birth of a modern madness. A society with electricity, steam engines, and suffocating corsets decided that the human face too could be improved. Never mind that medicine hadn't quite figured out infection control yet. It was the dawn of dangerous beauty, where science met vanity, where progress met delusion, and where the quest to look perfect began costing people their health, their money, and sometimes their lives. The Edwardians wanted eternal youth. What they got instead was the beginning of a billion-dollar industry powered by insecurity and a few too many scalpels. Humour, in hindsight. It wasn't self-care, it was self-scare. In Edwardian society, you were what you looked like. The cut of your coat, the curve of your waist, the shine of your shoes, all of it screamed your place on the social ladder louder than any introduction ever could. It was an age when first impressions weren't just social niceties, they were survival tactics. From London to Liverpool, the Edwardian world was obsessed with surface. You couldn't simply be good, kind, or hard-working. No one could see that at a glance. But they could see your wrinkles. And in an era that prized elegance above all else, being plain wasn't a neutral condition. It was a professional disadvantage. This was especially true for women. The Edwardian ideal of beauty was a treacherous mix of youth, vitality, and fragility. A kind of I'm glowing but also might faint aesthetic. Pale skin was prized, proof you didn't labour outdoors. Soft hands were status symbols, and curves had to be arranged like architectural elements, dramatic yet delicate. The famous S-shaped silhouette, corseted waists and thrust-out busts, wasn't just fashion, it was identity armour. Your waistline was your resume, your cheekbones your business card. If you wanted to marry well, work respectably, or simply avoid being mistaken for a housemaid, you had to look the part. The Edwardians loved hierarchy, and beauty became its most visible badge. Magazines and etiquette manuals only made it worse. Publications like The Queen or The Lady's Pictorial offered step-by-step guides to achieving a complexion worthy of high company, as though one could polish away poverty with cold cream. A woman's presentation was said to reflect her moral fibre. If your dress was wrinkled, your soul probably was too, but the pressure didn't stop with women. Men faced their own performance of refinement. The perfect gentleman was expected to have immaculate grooming, neatly waxed moustache, oiled hair, a spotless collar, and posture that suggested moral uprightness and mild constipation. Any deviation, a stain, a slouch, a spot, hinted at moral weakness. The Edwardian elite treated appearance like social warfare. There were entire books devoted to how to carry oneself with grace, because walking too briskly made you look common, and smiling too much made you look American. The rich, of course, could outsource their grooming. Manservants polished boots, maids prepared beauty baths, and hairdressers whispered the latest London trends. The working class, meanwhile, had to improvise, using kitchen flour for powder, coal soot for eyeliner, and hope for moisturiser. Even architecture reflected this obsession. Drawing rooms were filled with mirrors and photographs, constant reminders to adjust, improve, perfect. Public outings were performances, and you were the show. Edwardian parks became outdoor catwalks, with promenades specifically designed for strolling, observing, and being observed, and heaven forbid you aged. Grey hair and sagging skin weren't signs of experience, yet they were social suicide. A single wrinkle could demote you faster than a scandal. The cruel irony: women were expected to remain fresh forever, despite living in a world full of soot, stress, and limited access to clean water. This endless beauty contest extended to every corner of life. Even servants were hired based on appearance. A neat and comely maid supposedly reflected well on her mistress. The human body itself became a mirror of class: pale skin for the rich, tanned for the labourer, hands either soft and idle or calloused and condemned. All this visual judgment bred anxiety, a constant, invisible competition. Edwardians might have smiled politely, but behind those smiles was pure panic. Social survival depended on maintaining the illusion of perfection. And illusions require upkeep, creams, corsets, and soon enough scalpels, because when society worships appearances, it inevitably creates a market for miracles. And the Edwardians were about to meet their high priests of transformation, men and women who claimed they could fix any flaw for a price. The age of appearances demanded devotion, and the altar of beauty was just getting built. Before there were licensed plastic surgeons, there were beauty doctors, and the quotation marks are doing a lot of work here. These weren't the white-coated professionals we imagine today. Many were barbers, travelling salesmen, or self-taught specialists with more confidence than credentials. They promised transformation and often delivered trauma. In Edwardian cities, especially London and Paris, the line between medicine and miracle blurred dangerously. Advertisements appeared in newspapers: Dr. Fontaine's painless facial perfection, or Professor Lorimer's marvellous nose correction without knife. Behind the grand titles were individuals with dubious medical experience and even more dubious ethics. Some set up shop in small rented rooms, draped with velvet curtains to suggest sophistication. Others operated out of beauty parlours, offering scientific enhancements alongside hair curling and manicures. A few even toured like magicians, performing before and after demonstrations to gasping audiences. Imagine a travelling circus of vanity, with chloroform. Many beauty doctors were actually former barbers. Historically, barbers had dabbled in minor surgery, pulling teeth, lancing boils, and the occasional battlefield amputation. By the Edwardian period, they simply redirected their knives to more lucrative targets: faces. A little nip here, a little tuck there, they'd assure nervous clients, before proceeding to carve like Sunday roast. The Edwardian thirst for aesthetic improvement made these quacks rich. They offered everything from wrinkle removal to chin elevation, promising to restore youth, beauty, and social success. Results varied from mild improvement to permanent haunting, and because shame was part of the game, clients rarely spoke out. A ruined nose could be blamed on a carriage accident, a collapsed cheek on neuralgia. Lawsuits were rare, not just from fear of embarrassment, but because the industry wasn't regulated. There was no licensing board, no oversight, and certainly no hygiene standards. Ironically, some of the most famous beauty doctors were women. Figures like Madame Rachel in the late Victorian era had already shown how profitable selling beauty illusions could be. The Edwardian successors built on her legacy. Part entrepreneur, part illusionist, all risk. They preyed on the era's deepest insecurities. Too pale, too plump, too plain? Every perceived imperfection became an opportunity for profit. Beauty wasn't just personal anymore. It was professionalized. The wealthy sought these procedures in secret, often travelling abroad to avoid gossip. Paris and Berlin became cosmetic capitals, offering discreet transformations. Meanwhile, the middle class relied on local experts, who might just as easily double as fortune tellers or chemists. Procedures often involved injections of paraffin wax to smooth wrinkles or reshape noses. Yes, wax. It looked great until it didn't, sometimes migrating under the skin, melting, or causing chronic inflammation. But it was modern, scientific, and therefore irresistible. These self-proclaimed beauty doctors became early architects of modern aesthetic medicine, though unintentionally. Their failures, disasters, and grotesque experiments eventually forced real surgeons to take notice, establishing the beginnings of legitimate plastic surgery. But at the time, the results were unpredictable. A few clients emerged looking radiant. Most emerged looking rearranged. In Edwardian society, where silence was dignity, few dared to complain. A ruined face was a private tragedy quietly powdered over, and so the beauty doctors flourished. They were the alchemists of insecurity, turning fear into fortune and faces into cautionary tales. The Edwardians were nothing if not determined. If creams and massages couldn't deliver the desired perfection, then steel would. Enter the dawn of early cosmetic surgery, a terrifying blend of bravery, vanity, and complete medical ignorance. Surgical procedures to alter appearance weren't entirely new. Battlefield surgeons had been repairing noses and jaws for centuries. But in the Edwardian era, such operations stepped out of military tents and into genteel parlours. Cutting for confidence, they called it, as though slicing through flesh were merely an act of optimism. The most common procedures included facelifts, scar removal, and nose reshaping, all performed with tools that looked alarmingly like something you'd find in a blacksmith's workshop. There was little to no anesthesia, and antiseptic practices were optional. Sterilisation? An Edwardian surgeon might scoff. That's what you do to gossip, not scalpels. One early technique for facelifting involved literally cutting around the hairline, pulling the skin tight and sewing it back in place. The result was a smoother face, and a permanent expression of mild terror. Patients were often told to rest quietly for weeks, though most fainted long before resting. Nose reshaping or rhinoplasty was even riskier. Surgeons sometimes used cartilage grafts from other body parts or injected paraffin wax to achieve fashionable symmetry. For a few weeks, the results could look miraculous. Then the wax would migrate, harden, or melt, sometimes dripping down the face like a tragic candle. And because this was all happening in private homes or unlicensed clinics, infection was rampant. Stories circulated of women whose minor enhancements turned into life-threatening wounds. Yet, astonishingly, demand grew. People were willing to risk everything, reputation, money, even survival, for the promise of beauty. These procedures weren't cheap. A simple nose refinement might cost a month's wages for a working woman, or the price of a holiday for a gentleman. And unlike a holiday, there were no postcards, only bandages. Patients endured it all for one reason: social power. In a world obsessed with appearances, a more refined face could mean better marriage prospects, career advancement, or simply the ability to walk into a ballroom without dread. Surgery was a social investment, risky but potentially transformative. Of course, the irony was brutal. Many who sought these surgeries to gain confidence ended up disfigured, isolated, or humiliated. But the Edwardian belief in improvement at any cost was unshakable. Pain was noble, sacrifice elegant. And for every disaster there was one success story, one socialite whose tightened jawline became the envy of London. Those rare victories fueled the myth that beauty was worth suffering for, that science could make you better, newer, more acceptable. So they kept cutting. Behind lace curtains and closed doors, scalpels glinted in the lamplight, reshaping faces and fates alike. The Edwardian beauty dream was no longer about powders and potions. It was surgical now, a matter of blood, bone and bravery. And as society clapped politely at every improvement, the real question lingered beneath the bandages. Was it confidence they were buying, or just a prettier version of fear? In Edwardian England, nothing was more terrifying than being found out. You could cheat at cards, gossip about your neighbours, or even secretly eat dinner without your corset, the horror. But admit to cosmetic surgery? Absolutely not. That was social suicide. For all their obsession with appearances, Edwardian society demanded that beauty look effortless. You could spend hours perfecting your complexion, but heaven forbid anyone knew you tried. If you came home with bandages, you didn't say, "I had a facelift." You said, "I wrestled a curtain rod." It wasn't just shame, it was class warfare wrapped in gauze. The wealthy elite prided themselves on being naturally refined. Their delicate features and smooth skin were supposedly the result of good breeding and moral superiority, not scalpels and chloroform. Admitting to surgical help was like confessing that your family fortune came from selling cabbages instead of colonial trade. So, cosmetic procedures went underground, literally. Many of these beauty improvements took place in basements of fashionable salons or behind discreet velvet curtains in private homes. Respectable women entered through side doors, veiled and trembling, while the sound of street traffic above masked their cries of regret. To understand this secrecy, you have to appreciate just how obsessed Edwardian society was with reputation. It wasn't enough to look good, you had to be seen becoming good in the right way. Modesty was the moral foundation of womanhood, and the idea of voluntarily enduring a knife for vanity was scandalous. Publicly, beauty was supposed to be a byproduct of virtue, a lovely face reflecting a lovely soul. In practice, it was often the result of a man named Wainwright and a bottle of ether. Ladies' magazines preached natural improvement through diet, posture, and moral purity. But in the back pages of those same magazines, advertisements for scientific beauty correction whispered to readers who wanted faster results. The double standard was astounding. Women were pressured to look perfect, but punished for achieving it by unconventional means. That's why secrecy became a survival tactic. A socialite might disappear from London for a rest cure in the countryside and return with mysteriously tighter cheeks. Another might claim neuralgia to explain her head bandages. Husbands were told nothing. Friends pretended to believe the stories, and servants were sworn to silence, though most undoubtedly gossiped about it by the fire that same evening. It was an elaborate performance of denial. One famous anecdote tells of an actress who, after a disastrous nose surgery, blamed her new appearance on a riding accident. The press, ever polite, reported that her horse had good taste in symmetry. Society chuckled, nodded, and collectively agreed to never mention it again. Even the doctors, or beauty specialists as they preferred to call themselves, played along. Their offices were decorated like drawing rooms, complete with lace curtains and perfumed air, to disguise the reality of what happened there. Surgical instruments were hidden away when visitors arrived, replaced with jars of tonic water and skin restorers. The goal was to make their work look more like art than anatomy. Payment was equally discreet. Some clients paid in cash, others through intermediaries. A few sent jewellery or heirlooms. It was easier to pawn a diamond necklace than to explain a medical bill for nasal reconstruction. And of course, word still spread, in whispers. The upper-class rumour mill was a marvel of selective blindness. Everyone knew someone who had been improved, but no one admitted to knowing how. It became a kind of underground club, the secret society of slightly altered faces. There was a particular thrill in it too. Surgery wasn't just about vanity, it was about rebellion. In a world that demanded women be passive, enduring a secret operation to control your appearance was, in its own twisted way, an act of agency. Pain became empowerment, at least until the bandages came off. But the secrecy had real dangers, because everything was done in the shadows. There was no accountability. Quack surgeons could botch procedures without fear of exposure. If something went wrong, victims often lied about the cause, allowing the same practitioner to continue their work, or their damage, unchecked. Worse, the shame could be deadly. Women suffering post-surgical infections often delayed seeking real medical help for fear of scandal. Better to die a lady, one magazine joked darkly, than to live a cautionary tale. Many took that sentiment to heart. This underground culture even influenced fashion. Wide-brimmed hats and thick veils weren't just stylish, they were practical camouflage. A well-placed feather could hide a stitched temple, and a layer of tulle could conceal swelling from a secret improvement. It wasn't just vanity driving Edwardian fashion. It was survival through accessorizing. And yet, despite the secrecy, the allure of transformation kept spreading. Every whisper of success inspired 10 more hidden procedures. Every well-preserved face became a rumour. She looks incredible for her age. Do you think she had something done? That's how the underground system sustained itself, through gossip disguised as admiration. Society condemned the act but celebrated the results. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Surgery was shameful, but looking surgically perfect? That was divine. In the end, secrecy didn't kill the beauty craze. It fueled it. The risk, the thrill, the taboo, all of it made the pursuit of perfection even more intoxicating. Cosmetic surgery wasn't just a physical act. It was a social dance performed behind drawn curtains. By the time the lamps dimmed and the carriages rolled away, London was full of women whose reflections told a story no one dared to speak aloud. Beneath the powder and propriety lay stitches, scars, and silent pride. The hidden marks of a generation desperate to look flawless in a world that demanded perfection, but denied its cost. The Edwardians had mastered the art of pretending in manners, in morals, and now in medicine. And if you ever saw a lady in a wide hat, cheeks suspiciously taut and eyes that didn't quite blink the same way, well, you didn't ask. After all, polite society preferred its secrets bandaged. Many surgeons skipped anesthesia entirely, claiming pain built character. Humour. There was no anesthesia unless you count passing out from pain. Picture yourself in early 20th century London. You've booked a clandestine procedure because your cheeks have begun to betray you. But when you arrive, the surgeon smiles, waves you onto a velvet couch, offers a weak cordial and whispers, "Relax, this is all character building." There is no gas mask, no snore machine, no lights off, wake up pretty. There is simply the knife and your grit. Welcome to the Edwardian era of cosmetic surgery, where pain was part of the package. It is tempting to assume that by the Edwardian age, seen on 1901 to 1910, anesthesia was widespread and reliable. After all, by 1846 the inhalation of ether had been demonstrated in a major surgery in the US Wikipedia to Wikipedia +2. But the reality for many cosmetic procedures in the Edwardian beauty craze was far less refined. For many self-styled beauty doctors and quacks, a full anaesthetic was a luxury, a risk, or simply unwanted. Their motto, "If you faint, we'll know you cared." Why was anaesthesia so often missing or minimal in these procedures? Firstly, the clinics were often informal, private, and unregulated. The practitioner might be a barber surgeon moonlighting as a facial sculptor. They lacked the operating theatre apparatus and anaesthetist team the hospital had. So skipping or minimising anaesthesia kept costs down and secrecy high. Secondly, there was a twisted aspect of culture. Some practitioners claimed that the ordeal itself contributed to the outcome. The suffering of the patient showed commitment to beauty, signalled moral fortitude, and added social proof. She endured that for her face, therefore she is serious about society. Pain became a badge of honour, not just a side effect. Some adverts implied as much. Fainting from the procedure was practically reassuring. If you passed out, you knew you were improved. Thirdly, the anaesthetics that were available were often mishandled or dangerous. Ether and chloroform had been introduced in the mid-19th century, but administering them safely required knowledge and equipment. NCBI +2 PMC +2. In small parlours, one may get a drop of ether, sip of laudanum, or even nothing at all, or just bravado. The result, some patients screamed, some went pale, some fainted, and some died. The risk-to-reward ratio for beauty improvement was often horrifying. Imagine the procedure. You recline in a chaise in a curtained room. The practitioner greets you, asks you to breathe deep and steady, perhaps applies a cloth dampened with ether over your face for 30 seconds. After that, 10 minutes of incisions, sutures, cauterization, pulling of skin. You're told to remain still, smile politely, and remember that this is for society. Afterwards, you wake, bandaged, swollen, perhaps delirious. Real anesthesia? Not quite. Just unconsciousness induced by shock, fear, or the drip of porter. There was no anesthesia unless you count passing out from pain. In many cases, patients did pass out from pain anyway, and the practitioner casually noted, "Oh, you fainted. Good sign." But what a sign. Absence of cry for help doesn't equal painlessness. The culture of silence, of non-admission, meant the suffering remained invisible. No one asked in polite society, "Did it hurt?" They asked, "Do you look improved?" And if the answer was yes, the pain was assumed worth it. Another complicating factor, anesthesia in the broader surgical world was still assuming its modern form. Sterility, monitoring, ventilation, all of that was in flux. Cosmetic surgery was often even further behind. Hospitals and academic surgeons might experiment with chloroform or ether in controlled settings. In a private beauty clinic, you got what you got. PM-C1, the surgeon's priority was the result, a tighter jaw, a straighter nose, not the comfort of the patient. The psychological dimension is also interesting. Pain was believed to prove that transformation was genuine. If someone could endure the agony of a facelift without anesthesia, then society would believe they'd traded a plain face for a refined one, earned it. This made cosmetic surgery a kind of ritual of endurance, not just alteration. People entered the procedure not only to look better, but to mark themselves as worth improving. Of course, this meant many things went wrong. Without proper anesthesia and monitoring, complications soared: hemorrhage, infection, death. Yet because all of this happened behind closed doors, the stories stayed secret. The expectation of silence, discomfort, hidden scars, all this kept the cycle going. Yet the irony, the very absence of anesthesia, the very risk of pain became part of the marketing. "Our method is swift," some adverts claimed almost proudly. "You will recover, though you may faint." The feint was a testament to your bravery and their skill. The Edwardian ear was attuned to suffering as stillness. Those who didn't moan were thought refined. That's horrifying when you think who was going under knives for cosmetic improvement, not for necessity. As time passed, the realities of pain, complications, infection and death forced greater scrutiny. Surgeons began to develop safer methods, anesthesiology evolved, antisepsis strengthened. But in the heat of the beauty craze era, many women, and yes, a surprising number of men, underwent improvements with virtually no safety net. The anesthesia problem wasn't just about lacking gas, it was about lacking ethics, regulation, transparency. In summary, in the Edwardian beauty surgery craze, anesthesia was the weak link. Many procedures skipped it entirely, others used it half-heartedly. Pain was downplayed as a virtue, fainting treated as proof, suffering hidden behind lace and smiles. The line between self-improvement and self-harm blurred. If you came home with bandages, you didn't say, "I had a facelift." You shrugged, said, "I was feeling faint," and society nodded politely, unaware of the agony behind your new jawline. Beauty at that time didn't require comfort. It required endurance, and that makes the Edwardian obsession look less like glamour and more like a gauntlet. In Edwardian society, aging wasn't simply a biological process, it was a public embarrassment. The moment your skin lost its youthful glow or your hair dared to hint at silver, you might as well have declared bankruptcy on desirability. Turning 30 was like announcing your retirement from attractiveness. You could still attend parties, but only as decorative background furniture, the human equivalent of wallpaper with opinions. The Edwardian era worshipped youth the way medieval knights worshipped the Holy Grail, obsessively, futilely, and with a strong likelihood of self-injury. The empire was built on appearances, and nothing appeared more threatening to that order than a woman with laugh lines. This was a time when beauty wasn't just admired, it was a form of social currency. Youth was proof of vitality, wealth, and moral worth. The young and fresh-faced were believed to embody purity. While wrinkles implied either moral decay or too much thinking are both unattractive traits. You weren't supposed to look wise. You were supposed to look dewy and mildly confused. The early 1900s marked the golden age of rejuvenation. From the parlours of Mayfair to the advertisements in the Queen, the message was clear. You could defy nature if you had the cash. Anti-aging creams promised to restore youthful bloom. Tonics offered to purify the blood and refresh the complexion. Even newspapers printed recipes for eternal freshness, which often involved raw egg yolks, lemon juice, or the occasional dash of formaldehyde, because nothing says vitality like embalming fluid. For those with deeper pockets and shallower patience, beauty salons offered scientific youth treatments, facial massages with electricity, galvanic rollers that sent mild shocks through the skin, and thermal masks that felt suspiciously like being baked alive, all sold under the pretense of modern medicine. It was an era when progress and pain went hand in hand, and people would gladly endure both if it meant shaving 5 years off their face. Youth was particularly cruelly policed among women. The Edwardian ideal woman was soft, glowing, and perpetually 22. Society celebrated her innocence while simultaneously demanding she possess the poise and wardrobe of a duchess. It was an impossible standard that aged women faster than time itself. Every year, past 25 was a quiet scandal. Magazines warned readers to begin anti-aging prevention early. A woman should start caring for her face at 18, one 1905 article advised. Lest neglect show itself by her mid-20s. Translation: your teenage years were not for joy, they were for panic preparation. The cosmetics industry pounced on that insecurity like a cat on a loose feather boa. New miracle creams appeared every month, promising to erase wrinkles, tighten sagging skin, and return that elusive glow of innocence. The labels were scientific gibberish: bismuth lotion, formalin tonic, Vita Rays face food. Most were harmless nonsense. Others contained lead, mercury, or ammonia. The results varied from mild improvement to please contact your next of kin. Men weren't entirely free from the cult's reach either. While society forgave them the occasional grey hair, often calling it distinguished, baldness was still a public humiliation. Hair tonics and scalp elixirs flooded the market, promising regrowth through galvanic stimulation, which usually meant someone zapping your scalp with a crank-powered contraption until you smelled faintly of burning optimism. The upper classes, terrified of being left behind in the beauty arms race, turned into medical interventions. Surgeons experimented with rejuvenation procedures, tightening facial muscles, removing drooping skin, even injecting paraffin wax to fill out aging cheeks. The results were unpredictable. A lucky few emerged looking refreshed. Others looked permanently surprised. But in an age where gossip was more dangerous than gangrene, people pretended not to notice. Then there were the truly bizarre youth therapies that promised results from within. Animal gland therapy, yes, that's exactly what it sounds like, involved injecting extracts of animal organs. Believed to boost vitality, monkey glands were especially popular among older gentlemen hoping to restore youthful vigour. The procedure was equal parts pseudoscience and nightmare fuel, but it became a fashionable topic at dinner parties, because nothing says refinement like small talk about stolen monkey parts. Even language bent to the cult of youth. Women weren't called middle-aged. That was practically a slur. They were well preserved. If someone said you were still handsome for your age, you might as well have received condolences. Entire wardrobes were designed to disguise the passage of time. Pastel gowns to reflect soft light, high collars to hide neck wrinkles, gloves to conceal veiny hands. Fashion became camouflage in the war against aging. But perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that the Edwardian world expected women to age gracefully, while simultaneously ensuring that graceful meant invisible. Once past a certain age, your social invitations dwindled, your suitors evaporated, and your name appeared less frequently in gossip columns. It wasn't just beauty you lost with age, it was relevance. The cult of youth didn't simply idolize the young, it exiled everyone else. Behind closed doors, however, many women raged against the injustice. Private diaries and letters reveal their frustration with the double standard. They knew they were being judged for something inevitable, yet they also understood the power beauty wielded in society. Aging wasn't just a physical change, it was a demotion. And so the desperate pursuit of youth continued, just with creams, massages, injections, and even scalpels. Every new promise was another candle lit on the altar of vanity. The Edwardian obsession with staying young wasn't just about beauty. It was about survival in a world where youth equaled worth. The tragedy, of course, is that no one could win. Even the most polished complexion couldn't outlast time. But that didn't stop the Edwardians from trying. They built an empire on illusion, and youth was its most fragile export. The good news, you're glowing. The bad news is probably mercury. By the Edwardian era, beauty magazines had evolved into something far more dangerous than idle reading. They were glossy handbooks for self-doubt, monthly manuals reminding readers that yes, your faces could always use a little more improvement. If the Edwardians had Instagram, it would have looked suspiciously like the ladies' realm, full of perfectly posed women, impossibly smooth complexions, and advertisements that could sell you both confidence and cyanide in the same jar. The beauty press of the early 1800s was a cultural phenomenon. Publications like Woman's World, The Queen, and The Ladies' Field reached an audience larger than ever before thanks to industrial printing. Every page glowed with illustrated promises. Erase 10 years in 10 minutes. Transform your nose without surgery. New liquid facelift. Science in a bottle. They were basically the Instagram filters of 1905, but with more arsenic. The Edwardian magazine industry knew exactly how to prey on its readers by mixing pseudoscience with poetic marketing. Their writers wielded adjectives like scalpels, vivifying, rejuvenating, revitalizing, scientifically blended. Every cream was exclusive, every tonic was proprietary, and every testimonial read like the script of a Victorian melodrama. After 1 week, my wrinkles vanished. My husband smiled again, and even my maid said I looked radiant. Never mind that the testimonial was often written by the same man who owned the factory. In a world without consumer protection laws or truth in advertising standards, these claims went unchecked. The Edwardians had no FDA, no ingredient list, and no concept of maybe don't smear mercury on your eyelids. Many cosmetics were concocted in backrooms with ingredients that sounded like a chemistry quiz gone rogue. Lead carbonate for whitening, carbolic acid for cleansing, and mercuric chloride for refinement of pores. If your skin didn't glow, it was probably because it had burned off. One particularly infamous ad promised Dr. Lamour's instant nose corrector. It was a small spring-loaded clip you attached to your nose for 30 minutes a day. Painless, permanent, the ad insisted. In practice, it was about as painless as sticking your face in a mousetrap. Another miracle product, Madame Tussauds Liquid Facelift, claimed to tighten the skin by immediate dermal contraction. The formula contained alcohol, formaldehyde, and crushed pearl powder, or, as one might summarize, regret in a bottle. But the genius of Edwardian advertising lay in its emotional manipulation. These magazines didn't sell products, they sold panic. Each issue created new insecurities to solve. Too pale, too pink, too plump, too thin, too old, too plain. The Edwardian woman could open a single page and discover 5 new reasons to hate her reflection before breakfast. "Is your chin too bold?" asked one headline. "Does your smile betray your age?" wondered another. The implied answer was always yes, and conveniently there was a lotion for that. Even the illustrations were designed to torment. Artists drew idealized women with porcelain complexions and mathematical symmetry, gazing into mirrors with a smugness that seemed to whisper, "You could look like me if you tried harder." The Edwardian beauty ideal was impossible by design. If perfection could be purchased, it could be resold forever. To make matters worse, many magazines blurred the line between editorial advice and paid advertising. Articles that looked like beauty tips were often covert product endorsements. Our beauty correspondent recommends usually meant our publisher got paid to say this, and the language was intoxicating. Phrases like scientific wonder and marvel of modern chemistry gave readers the illusion that progress itself had a price tag. In working-class circles, cheaper newspapers and pamphlets peddled similar nonsense under more desperate terms. Transform yourself at home, these ads shouted. No doctors, no pain. The irony being that both were inevitable. These miracle cures often led to rashes, infections, or worse. One London woman reportedly went blind after using an eye brightening elixir containing belladonna, literally deadly nightshade. The ingredient list might as well have read, "Results may include sudden eternal youth," by which we mean death. Still, the allure of modernity was irresistible. The Edwardians lived in an age where technology seemed to promise everything: electricity, automobiles, telephones. Why shouldn't a lotion turn back time? The word scientific carried a kind of magic. If it fizzed, stung, or smelled faintly of a laboratory explosion, it must be working. For men too, there were miracle cures. The same magazine sold youth restorers for gentlemen, offering hair regrowth tonics, moustache darkeners, and complexion purifiers. The advertising was careful to sound manly, no talk of beauty, only vigour, vitality, and the restoration of virile appearance. In reality, these products were often the same formulas as women's creams, repackaged with the scent of tobacco and self-delusion. What made these magazines especially powerful was their tone, that blend of authority and intimacy. They spoke to readers as trusted friends, not merchants. "We women must not neglect ourselves," one column lectured, "for neglect leads to sorrow and shadows upon the heart." The Cure, a 7-shilling rejuvenation cream conveniently sold by the same publisher. And so the cycle continued. The magazines created the insecurity, then sold the solution, then published a follow-up story praising the results. It was the perfect closed loop, a 1905 version of today's influencer economy. Except instead of filters and Photoshop, Edwardian women had powders, poisons, and the constant anxiety of public scrutiny. What's truly astonishing is how modern it all feels. The same psychological hooks still work today. Fear of aging, envy of perfection, the promise of effortless transformation. We may have traded arsenic for retinol, but the message hasn't changed. You could always be better. The Edwardian magazines were not just selling cosmetics, they were manufacturing discontent. Every glossy page whispered the same poisonous lullaby. "You're almost beautiful." Almost. Buy this, and maybe you'll get there. In truth, these miracle cures didn't offer youth. They sold permission to hope for it. And hope, as every Edwardian advertiser knew, was the most profitable ingredient of all. The moral: the next time you see a revolutionary beauty secret, remember your Edwardian predecessors. They too believed the hype, and some glowed for it. Literally. By the early 1900s, the Edwardian world was beginning to wobble. The empire still liked to think of itself as eternal, but the carriages were sharing the roads with automobiles, telegrams were being replaced by telephones, and women, those previously decorative fixtures of drawing rooms, were beginning to think alarming thoughts about independence. The newspapers called them the new women, as if they were a recently patented invention, and they terrified polite society. These new women cycled without chaperones, read novels that weren't about marriage, and, most dangerously of all, decided their faces and bodies were their own business. They cut their hair short, loosened their corsets, and walked around as though oxygen belonged to them too. The old guard looked on in horror, clutching their monocles. To them, this wasn't social change. It was the apocalypse in the petticoats. But behind the scandalized headlines lay a deeper truth. Women were finally gaining access to education, wages, and, for the first time in history, purchasing power. And with that came the freedom to decide how to present themselves to the world. beauty became less about pleasing husbands or parents and more about personal expression. At least that was the theory. In practice, freedom came with fine print. Side effects may include death. The rise of the new woman coincided perfectly with the booming beauty industry. Cosmetics, once a guilty secret of actresses and courtesans, began to infiltrate middle-class respectability. A dash of rouge here, a dab of powder there, small rebellions disguised as complexion improvement. Women who once whispered their purchases to chemists now marched into department stores with confidence. Self-adornment became an act of defiance. Yet even as these women sought control, the world tried to reassert it. Advertisements subtly reframed beauty as empowerment, while keeping the old insecurities alive. A modern woman must care for her appearance, one 1908 article declared, for her success in business and society depends upon it. Translation: you can have freedom, dear, but please stay attractive while you're at it. The Edwardian new woman lived in a paradox. She could earn her own money, but her value was still tied to how youthful she appeared. She could ride a bicycle alone, but only if she did so gracefully. She could pursue higher education, but God forbid she looked tired while doing it. In short, she could have autonomy, as long as she remained photogenic. This new autonomy also meant access to choices once reserved for the elite, including the dangerous world of cosmetic surgery. For women tired of being judged, the idea of reshaping one's own face carried an intoxicating sense of control. They weren't merely being altered, they were choosing transformation. Never mind that the surgeon's office looked more like a crime scene than a clinic. Some saw beauty operations as a feminist act, a reclaiming of the body from the moralists and matrons who policed it. But others fell into the same old trap, chasing an impossible ideal defined by men, illustrated in magazines, and sold in tiny glass bottles. What looked like empowerment often ended up as exploitation in prettier packaging, and yet for all the risk, many new women persisted. They experimented with bold new fashions, tailored suits, cropped hairstyles, uncorseted dresses that allowed them to breathe. They walked through London streets with a confidence their mothers couldn't have imagined. Their makeup was lighter, their steps faster, and their opinions louder. The public saw danger in this, as though every rouge pot were a manifesto. Male commentators responded with predictable panic. Newspapers warned that cosmetics and independence would unbalance the female constitution. Doctors claimed that makeup clogged not only pores but morals. Even King Edward VII supposedly disapproved of women who painted. Naturally, this only made painting more popular. Among the more daring circles, actresses, artists, writers, beauty became an aesthetic playground. They embraced eccentric styles, exotic perfumes, dramatic eyeliner inspired by Egyptian tomb art, even tinted hair. The theatricality of beauty became a declaration of individuality. Society called them scandalous, they called themselves modern. But empowerment carried physical danger. The same scientific creams that promised liberation often contained toxic metals. Early hair dyes used lead acetate. Skin lighteners contained mercury. Blushes were laced with carmine made from crushed insects and alcohol. To look bold was to risk blindness, rash, or poisoning. For the new woman, control over her body came with the risk of losing it entirely. Meanwhile, suffragists were fighting another battle, not just for votes, but for the right to exist without judgment. Many suffragettes intentionally rejected beauty standards, wearing simple clothing to prove women could be taken seriously without decoration. Yet even they were mocked in caricatures as unfeminine, ugly, or mannish. Society's message was clear. Whether you embraced beauty or rejected it, you were still doing it wrong. Still, the connection between beauty and freedom couldn't be undone. The act of buying lipstick, of styling one's own hair, of deciding how to look, these were small revolutions. For centuries, women's appearances had been curated by fathers, husbands, and fashion dictates. How they could at least choose which poison to wear. Some used beauty strategically. wielding it like a weapon in a man's world. A clever woman could charm her way into social circles, business class deals, even political influence. The line between manipulation and mastery blurred deliciously. The new woman didn't just wear rouge, she weaponized it. By 1910, London streets were alive with contradictions. Suffragettes marching in sensible skirts, society ladies in electric facial masks, and shop girls testing lipstick in the reflection of department store windows. It was an age of reinvention, messy, contradictory, and utterly human. The rise of the new woman wasn't just about changing laws, it was about reclaiming mirrors. For the first time, women could ask not just, how do I look, but who do I want to be? And if the answer required a little danger, a little scandal, and a lot of arsenic-based powder, well, that was the price of progress. Freedom, after all, came with fine print. Side effects may include independence and the occasional trip to the emergency room. The Edwardians had discovered electricity and immediately decided to rub it all over themselves. The same miraculous force that powered the new street lamps of London and made telegraphs hum across oceans quickly became the latest obsession in the quest for eternal youth. Electricity wasn't just modern, it was mystical. To the Edwardian mind, it was invisible energy that could animate machines, cure disease, and, with enough optimism, smooth out crow's feet. So when beauty entrepreneurs began promising electric rejuvenation, the public didn't see pseudoscience. They saw progress. What could possibly go wrong with applying household voltage to your face? The early 1900s were a golden age of electrified nonsense. Beauty salons rebranded themselves as electrotherapeutic studios, complete with glistening chrome contraptions, wires snaking across tables, and operators in pristine white coats that looked more like scientists than stylists. These weren't mere beauticians, they were galvanic specialists, which sounded far more respectable than woman who zaps cheeks for a living. Customers reclined in elegant chairs as metal wands, electrodes, and sponge-tipped rods buzzed against their skin. The goal? Stimulating cellular vitality. The result? Mild electrocution. The sensation was often described as a pleasant tingling by advertisements, a phrase suspiciously similar to how one might describe an oncoming heart attack. The devices themselves came in all shapes and levels of lunacy. The electro-complexion reviver promised to reawaken the skin through electrical harmonization. The Magneto Beauty Mask looked like something out of a horror play, a wire mesh helmet that delivered tiny shocks across the face, leaving users both radiant and slightly smoking. And then there was the Galvanic Breast Enhancer, a truly spectacular invention that claimed to firm, lift and enlarge through the invigorating influence of current. In reality, it mostly startled women into regretting every life choice that led them there, because nothing says self-love like electrocuting your wrinkles or your chest. Manufacturers competed to sound the most scientific. One 1908 brochure for the Lady Edison facial rejuvenator boasted of pulsing ionic oscillations that reverse facial fatigue. Another, the electrolymphatic purifier, claimed to drain away age toxins, which sounds impressive until you realize it's medically meaningless. Still, the branding worked, because to the Edwardians, science was the new religion, and electricity was its divine spark. Some devices were marketed for home use with charming instructions like, simply connect your lamp socket, moisten the sponges, and apply to desired region until rosy glow appears. Translation, plug it into the wall, hope your curtains don't catch fire, and pray your rosy glow isn't third-degree burns. These gadgets weren't limited to women either. Men's magazines advertised electric combs to cure baldness and electrotonic collars that promised to restore vigour and confidence. The implication was clear: true masculinity required regular, controlled electrocution. The only thing shocking about these devices was how many people bought them. The pseudoscientific theories behind all this crackling enthusiasm were delightfully absurd. Galvanism, named after Luigi Galvani, who famously made frog legs twitch with electricity, had been around for over a century. Edwardian inventors simply adapted the idea to human vanity. They claimed that aging was caused by sluggish electrical forces within the flesh, and that applying external current would restore youthful clarity. In other words, your face was a dead battery. Even newspapers joined the buzz, literally. In 1906, the Illustrated London News featured a full-page spread on electric beauty treatments of the future, showing fashionable women smiling serenely as wires wrapped around their temples like demented tiaras. The caption optimistically declared that electric science has placed beauty within every woman's reach. It neglected to mention that it might also place her within the reach of St. Peter. Some high-end salons offered full-body sessions, electric baths, where clients stood barefoot on the copper plates, while currents allegedly flowed through them to vitalize every organ. The experience was said to leave one feeling energized. It's unclear whether that referred to rejuvenation or the adrenaline surge of surviving electrocution. In fairness, a few of these treatments probably did produce visible effects, mostly redness, swelling, or temporary muscle tightening caused by electrical stimulation. Clients mistook these short-term reactions for signs of success. "The tingling means it's working," they said cheerfully, a phrase still haunting skincare enthusiasts over a century later. But the appeal of electric beauty went beyond vanity. It symbolized modernity. Electricity represented control, energy, and progress. To strap it to your face was to declare yourself a woman of the new century. Bold, scientific, and slightly flammable. It was futuristic self-care with sparks included. Of course, doctors were less enthusiastic. Medical journals quietly warned of electrical quackery, noting that improper use could cause burns, nerve damage, and fainting. But Edwardian society had little interest in such pessimism. Pain was fashionable, and danger was part of the charm. One salon even advertised its service as the treatment for the fearless. By 1910, electric beauty had become a social event. Women hosted galvanic parties where guests could take turns shocking themselves for fun, the Edwardian equivalent of a modern spa night, only with more voltage and fewer disclaimers. Laughter, champagne, and the occasional scream filled the drawing rooms of London as society literally buzzed with the promise of technological transformation. In retrospect, it's easy to laugh at the absurdity, the wires, the burns, the blind faith in science without understanding it. But the deeper truth is this: the Edwardians weren't fools, they were hopeful. Electricity had changed their world, lit their streets, powered their cities, connected their voices. Why shouldn't it light up their faces too? They just slightly overdid it. So if you ever feel silly about buying a vibrating jade roller or a microcurrent facial wand today, take comfort. You're part of a grand tradition stretching back over a century, one where people have always believed that a bit of electricity could fix everything, from heartbreak to forehead lines. The Edwardians might have zapped their way into mild disfigurement, but they did it with optimism, grace, and an excellent sense of fashion. After all, beauty fades, but irony, that's forever. By the early 1900s, the Edwardian beauty craze had moved from creams and electricity to something far bolder: carpentry of the face. And no facial real estate was under more scrutiny than the nose. It sat there, audaciously central, impossible to conceal beneath powder or lace. The Edwardians decided it said too much about class, race, ancestry, and attractiveness, and they weren't having it. If beauty was social currency, then the nose was your credit score. A refined nose meant good breeding, delicate sensibility, and probably a family portrait somewhere in Surrey. A large or crooked one, however, suggested barbarism, peasantry, or worse, individuality. Your nose wasn't a feature, as one satirical column put it. It was a negotiation. The Edwardian ideal nose was a paradox. Dainty yet distinguished, assertive yet feminine, like a duchess giving a gentle disapproval. It had to slope gracefully, with a narrow bridge and a tip that whispered good lineage. And because beauty ideals are cruelly democratic, This shape was demanded of everyone, regardless of what genetics had in mind. Enter rhinoplasty, the new miracle of scientific beauty. What had once been a battlefield necessity, reconstructing soldiers' shattered faces, became a fashionable elective procedure for civilians. London and Paris became centres for what newspapers coyly called nasal refinement. The operation was not for the faint of heart. Without reliable anesthesia or antibiotics, early rhinoplasty resembled a duel between surgeon and cartilage. Some surgeons shaved bone with scalpels, others sliced and sutured skin flaps to correct humps or droops. One French doctor even claimed to reshape noses through manipulation, which turned out to mean vigorous squeezing until something cracked. Advertisements offered subtle corrections without knife, though the without knife part was often aspirational. Patients were promised quick recovery, which usually translated to hide indoors for a month. A discreet veil or wide-brimmed hat was essential. If anyone asked, you hadn't undergone surgery, you had a touch of neuralgia or a riding accident. Still, the clientele grew. For upper-class women, a refined nose was an investment in social capital. For actresses, it was a professional necessity. The Edwardian stage favoured symmetry over talent. And for men, nose surgery was sold as restoration, not vanity. A gentleman could claim he was fixing a sporting injury or deviated septum. Honour remained intact, even if his cartilage did not. Class, as always, shaped the experience. Wealthy patients could afford reputable surgeons in private clinics, men with actual medical degrees and spotless waistcoats. The middle and working classes had to rely on beauty specialists or travelling practitioners who offered nose perfection in borrowed parlours. These cheaper procedures often involved paraffin wax injections, a practice that could go from instant refinement to melting disaster in a single summer afternoon. Yes, paraffin, that same stuff used in candles. Doctors injected it beneath the skin to build or smooth the nose. Initially, the results were promising. Faces looked symmetrical, refined, socially acceptable. Then gravity and body heat took over. The wax migrated, forming lumps, bumps, and, in some horrific cases, dripping deformities. One medical journal described a patient whose improvement had descended to the chin. The Edwardians called it progress. Despite the risks, the demand never waned. Newspapers even published before and after sketches to promote success stories. A lady of 35, one report announced, entered our clinic plain, anxious, raw and self-conscious. Upon completion, she was transformed into a creature of confidence and poise. The article neglected to mention that she couldn't feel half her face. But the obsession with noses wasn't just cosmetics, it was social. In an age obsessed with categorization, noses became shorthand for character. Pseudoscientific nose-reading books claimed to decode personality traits based on shape. Aquiline meant noble, snub meant playful, wide meant vulgar. Entire reputations hung on the curve of one's bridge. There was even a racial undertone to the craze. The Edwardians, steeped in the pseudoscience of eugenics, linked facial features to purity and class. A European nose was praised as the mark of refinement. Anything else was whispered about as coarse or foreign. It wasn't just beauty they were sculpting, it was conformity. Rhinoplasty became a way to edit one's heritage, to chisel oneself into social acceptability. Doctors capitalized on this fear with astonishing audacity. Some offered ethnic corrections, promising to erase undesirable national traits from the face. Advertisements targeted immigrants and outsiders seeking acceptance in rigid British society. Surgery became assimilation by scalpel, a deeply sinister chapter in the history of cosmetic medicine. Of course, not everyone bought into the madness. Satirical writers mocked the trend mercilessly. Punch magazine quipped, "If a perfect nose makes one beautiful, then half of London's women are unfinished." Playwrights used the craze for comedic effect, with characters returning from Paris mysteriously improved. But ridicule couldn't stop the momentum. Vanity, once electrified, doesn't power down easily. By 1910, the rhinoplasty industry was thriving. Medical conferences debated nasal aesthetics, and some doctors began keeping photographic archives of their transformations, the Edwardian equivalent of a plastic surgeon's Instagram feed. The difference was that the lighting back then was terrible, and the patients often fainted halfway through the photo session. The nose fixation represented the peak of the Edwardian beauty obsession, scientific ambition colliding with insecurity, wrapped in the language of progress. It wasn't about improving health or function. It was about survival in a society where beauty dictated worth. For some, the new nose brought confidence and opportunity. For others, it brought infection, ridicule, or lifelong pain. But to the Edwardians, that was the cost of progress, a little suffering for symmetry. Your nose wasn't a feature. It was a negotiation. Between class and self, between nature and vanity, between who you were and who you were expected to be. And as the Edwardians proudly paraded their newly sculpted profiles through gaslit streets, they couldn't have known they were setting the stage for a century where the scalpel would become as common as the mirror. Because once society learns it can edit the face, it never stops revising the manuscript. The Edwardians like to call it refinement. History, with less patience for euphemism, calls it what it was, infection. For every elegant socialite who emerged from a beauty operation looking newly radiant, there were dozens who didn't emerge quite the same way. Behind London's lace curtains and Paris's polished mirrors lay a quieter epidemic. Abscesses, blood poisoning, and faces that refused to heal. If it didn't kill you, it definitely gave you something to powder. Medicine in the early 1900s was still figuring out the basics. Bacteria were known, but not everyone believed in them. Some beauty surgeons dismissed sterilization as superstition, preferring to rely on intuition and brandy. A surgical scalpel might pass from one patient's cheek to another, with only a perfunctory wipe on a handkerchief. If the tools gleamed, yeah, that was good enough. Cleanliness by candlelight. The results were predictably disastrous. Newspapers occasionally reported mysterious illnesses following beauty treatments, though they never said the word infection. It wasn't polite to mention pus in print. Instead, journalists used euphemisms like unfortunate complications or a period of convalescence. Translation: the patient's immune system had declared war, and nobody won. The most common post-surgery issues were swelling, disfigurement, and necrosis, polite society's least fashionable accessory. One doctor in Berlin recorded that the majority of cosmetic patients experience certain tissue disappointments, which is a medical way of saying your face fell off. But because secrecy surrounded these procedures, there was no public outrage, no regulation. Women simply disappeared for rest cures, then reappeared weeks later with heavy veils, new hats, and awkward smiles. The wealthy could afford to vanish into the countryside until the worst was over. Working-class women had no such luxury. They went to cheaper practitioners in back rooms where surgical hygiene ranked somewhere between dubious and actively haunted. Those who survived the ordeal often bore permanent scars, uneven skin, distorted features, or patches of numbness. Yet the same society that pressured them into the operating chair also applauded their endurance. In a perverse twist, disfigurement was rebranded as courage. Such bravery, whispered acquaintances, admiring the woman who had suffered for beauty. Such resolve. It was cosmetic martyrdom sanctified by gossip, and oh the gossip. Rumours of disastrous transformations became the new social currency. A woman with suspiciously rigid cheeks might find herself whispered about in drawing rooms. Poor dear, someone would murmur. She was always so daring. The subtext. She tried to upgrade her face and the software crashed. Those who were lucky enough to heal reasonably well often leaned into the narrative of triumph. A few even wrote anonymously in women's magazines, describing their transformations in dramatic, near-religious tones. I endured agony, one confessed, but when I saw my reflection anew, I felt reborn. You could almost hear the chloroform sloshing between the lines. Doctors, for their part, encouraged this romanticization of suffering. They described their patients as heroic participants in the advancement of science. The public loved that idea. The beauty could be a noble sacrifice, a contribution to modernity. After all, this was an age obsessed with progress. Railways cut through landscapes, telegraphs conquered distance, and now even the human face was being re-engineered. If someone had to lose a bit of skin for civilization's sake, so be it. Meanwhile, behind the velvet curtains of respectability, the body count grew. Septicemia, gangrene and shock were common outcomes, rarely recorded, never discussed. Those who died often had their causes of death politely altered on the certificate. Complications from influenza sounded much better than cosmetic surgery gone rogue. Ironically, the scars these women bore became the foundation for future innovation. The visible failures forced real doctors, those with actual medical training, to take notice. The pioneering reconstructive surgeons who later treated World War I veterans often cited these early beauty tragedies as lessons in what not to do. Painful progress, literally etched in skin. Still, the culture refused to acknowledge the darker side of the beauty craze. Society adored the idea of transformation, the myth that a woman could ascend through courage, money, and a steady hand with a scalpel. It fit neatly into Edwardian narratives of self-improvement and moral willpower. To complain about the risks was to seem ungrateful to modernity itself. Women caught in this contradiction often turned to makeup to hide the evidence. Powders thickened, rouge deepened, and veils lowered. The post-surgical face became a battlefield of concealment. A touch of powder and prayer, as one wit put it, covers a multitude of surgical sins. Entire fashion trends emerged to assist. Hats with generous brims, high neck collars, and feathered headpieces large enough to distract from the tragedy beneath. Those whose scars couldn't be hidden sometimes withdrew from public life entirely. Diaries from the period describe quiet despair. Women who avoided mirrors, shuttered themselves indoors, or wrote bitterly about being improved beyond recognition. Their pursuit of perfection had exiled them from the very society they wanted to impress. Yet even in this suffering, the Edwardian obsession refused to die. If anything, it grew stronger. For every failure, there was always someone who whispered, "She went to the wrong doctor. Mine's better." Hope, it turns out, is more infectious than bacteria. In a grim way, these women became the unsung architects of modern cosmetic surgery. Their pain forced change even if they never lived to see it. The antiseptic age, when it finally arrived, was paid for in their infections. So the next time you see an Edwardian portrait of a serene woman with powdered cheeks and an unreadable gaze, remember, the calm was curated. Behind the flawless finish may have been scars, swelling, or numbness, the quiet cost of living in an age where beauty was both aspiration and affliction. They suffered in silence, smiled through the pain and powdered the evidence. Because in Edwardian society there was no greater sin than letting people see how hard you'd work to be beautiful, and no greater irony than realizing, after all that the only truly flawless thing was the lie itself. In Edwardian London, secrets didn't just whisper, they had architecture. Behind respectable facades of hairdressers, milliners, and ladies' treatment parlours, a shadow industry flourished. The secret cosmetic clinics. These were the hidden cathedrals of vanity, where the wealthy went not for prayer, but for a little discreet resculpting. And hopefully not an obituary. To the casual passer-by, these places looked perfectly respectable. A delicate sign might read Madame Estelle's Complexion Studio, or the London Institute of Hygiene and Refinement. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rosewater and ambition. Women in lace gloves lounged on the velvet couches, pretending to read fashion magazines while avoiding eye contact, because no one wanted to admit why they were there. For behind the perfumed front rooms, past the soft chatter and respectable drapery, there was usually another door, the one that locked. Behind it, the salon transformed into a makeshift surgical suite. Mirrors gave way to gas lamps, perfume to the scent of antiseptic and sweat. Here worked the beauty specialists, part artist, part amateur surgeon, all ambition. Think of it as an early VIP service, if VIP stood for very injured person. These clandestine clinics existed because Edwardian society demanded perfection, but punished the pursuit of it. Cosmetic surgery was considered shameful, vulgar, even immoral. So naturally the rich queued for it in private. The upper classes could afford secrecy, and the secret clinics catered to their double lives. Women who publicly condemned vanity in others quietly booked appointments under aliases. Men who insisted they would never tamper with nature discreetly paid extra to have their hairlines advanced by an inch or two. Everything was arranged for plausible deniability. Appointments were made by coded telegrams or handwritten notes signed only with initials. Clients were ushered in through side entrances, sometimes disguised as service doors. In high-end neighbourhoods like Mayfair or Kensington, certain establishments even had dual floor plans: beauty parlour upstairs, surgical hideaway below. Staff were sworn to secrecy, often under threat of dismissal, or in some cases financial ruin. Gossip could sink a clinic faster than a bad operation, but the Edwardians, ever resourceful, found a way to cloak even failure in elegance. If a lady left with suspicious bandages, she was escorted through a private exit, bundled into her carriage, and instructed to say she was recovering from nerves, which technically was true. All of them were. The atmosphere inside these hidden rooms was a mix of elegance and horror. Gilded mirrors reflected blood-streaked gloves. Velvet curtains muffled the groans. Brass instruments lay on linen cloths beside bottles labelled chloroform, carbolic acid, and vanishing cream, as though order could disguise chaos. The practitioners, sometimes trained doctors, more often not, worked quickly, quietly, and with the confidence of men who had read half of a medical textbook once. Anesthetic use varied wildly. Some operators offered a whiff of ether, or a sip of brandy, others simply encouraged stoicism. "Be still, madam," one was known to say, or I shall give you 2 chins instead of 1. For all their danger, these clinics had a curious allure. They offered what respectable society could not: transformation without exposure. Their clientele included actresses desperate to stay youthful under the cruel glare of stage lights, heiresses repairing imperfections before their arranged marriages, and widows reinventing themselves for second husbands. One famous dowager reportedly had her wrinkles softened before hosting a charity gala and fainted into the punch bowl halfway through. The newspapers blamed the heat. Payment was always made in cash, often slipped discreetly into satin envelopes. Some clients bartered jewellery or family heirlooms too valuable to trace. Others left donations in exchange for silence. It was an unspoken rule. The more dangerous the operation, the higher the price. Not because it was safer, but because danger was expansive than to keep secret. Of course, not every secret stayed buried. Occasionally the gossip columns caught wind of a disaster. A certain lady of distinction might be said to have suffered greatly from an experimental treatment abroad. Abroad, in this case, could mean anything from Paris to the next block over. The doctors' names were never printed, but society always knew. There were entire dinner parties devoted to guessing who had improved too far. One particularly daring establishment in Paris reportedly catered exclusively to royalty and celebrities, offering midnight appointments and candlelit discretion. The walls were lined with portraits of satisfied clients, though some were painted before the procedure, just to be safe. Yet despite the secrecy and the danger, demand only grew. The Edwardian elite had discovered something intoxicating in the promise of reinvention. It wasn't just about beauty anymore, it was about control. In a rigid society built on birthright, money could now buy what lineage could not: the illusion of perfection. Some clients became almost addicted. A subtle lift here, A minor refinement there, soon they were regulars, visiting every season like clockwork. The clinics encouraged it, inventing new treatments for every conceivable flaw. One salon even advertised ear refinement for the socially forward lady. Another promised to harmonise the chin with the personality, a statement so vague it could justify anything short of decapitation. And yet, for all the risk, the secret clinics had their successes. A few skilled practitioners genuinely advanced surgical techniques, pioneering safer sutures, improved skin grafting and early antiseptic methods. Their hidden experiments laid the groundwork for what would later become legitimate reconstructive surgery. Ironically, modern medicine owes part of its progress to the vanity of Edwardian high society and the reckless genius of men with scalpels and secrecy clauses. Still, for every quiet success, there was a silent casualty. The walls of those backroom salons saw enough suffering to fill a hospital, only no one dared call them that. Pain was the cost of discretion. The Edwardians might not have believed in confession, but their mirrors knew everything. As the carriage wheels rolled away and the curtains closed behind them, the clients of these secret clinics left transformed, not always beautifully, but certainly irreversibly. They had risked reputation, health and humanity for the promise of looking like someone else. And though the bandages might fade, the real scar, the one society refused to see, was the fear that drove them there in the first place. The Edwardians loved to pretend beauty was a universal virtue, that anyone with discipline and proper care could achieve it. Of course, that was easy to say when you had a personal maid, imported French soap and 12 hours a day to think about your cheekbones. For the working-class woman, self-care meant trying not to die of exhaustion before 30, but still, the pressure to look respectable trickled downward. Even if you couldn't afford luxury, society expected you to fake it. And so began the great working-class experiment in do-it-yourself beauty, a combination of desperation, chemistry, and astonishing courage. It was the age of the coal dust glow, the arsenic blush, and the laundry bleach facial. The result? Luxury glow on a coal dust budget. While the wealthy could sneak into discreet clinics for refinement, the factory girls, laundresses, and shop clerks of London and Manchester were left with what they had: kitchen ingredients and dangerous imagination. Beauty recipes circulated through gossip, penny magazines and word of mouth for miracle cures that involved anything from vinegar to battery acid. If it fizzed or burned, it was considered promising. Take, for instance, the legendary acid peel for a new complexion. The recipe called for lemon juice, vinegar, and a splash of ammonia, applied nightly to remove old skin. It did remove something, yes, mostly skin. But for women who spent their days in sooty factories and dim workshops, a red face looked better than a dirty one. Bleach was another favourite. Laundry women who worked daily with harsh chemicals began experimenting with them for personal use. Advertisements encouraged this madness, promising that a drop of whitening fluid in warm water will ensure a flawless face. The result was a complexion that glowed faintly, because it was chemically burned. One factory girl reportedly boasted that her skin shone like porcelain. Her friends politely neglected to mention that porcelain also cracks. Then there was lead powder, the ultimate budget cosmetic. Sold under names like Pearl Bloom or Venus Dust, it promised aristocratic paleness for just a few pennies. The same element that lined paint cans and plumbing was now marketed as facial refinement. The Edwardians had apparently decided that death by heavy metals was an acceptable trade for a clear complexion. Women wore their pallor proudly, unaware that lead didn't just smooth wrinkles, it rewired the nervous system. Even more alarming were the home remedies for hair and eyes. Eyelash enhancers often involved petroleum mixed with lamp soot. Brow darkeners used burnt matches. Hair tonics, meanwhile, were concoctions of gin, onion juice, and God's forgiveness. Women who couldn't afford a hairdresser used candle wax to tame stray curls, a technique that worked beautifully until summer. But the real hallmark of working-class beauty wasn't just danger, it was ingenuity. The lower classes repurposed everything. Butter as moisturiser, flour as powder, beetroot as rouge. If you were a maid and your mistress threw out a nearly empty perfume bottle, you filled it with rose water and pretended it came from Paris. Respectability could be bottled and refilled with tap water when it ran low. And yet, for all its risks, these rituals meant something profound. In a world that constantly reminded working women of their place, beauty became a small act of rebellion. A polished veil, a neat hairstyle, even a dab of colour on the cheeks, it was a declaration of dignity. When you spent 12 hours scrubbing floors or sewing in dim light, a bit of powder wasn't vanity, it was survival armour. Still, the class divide in beauty was impossible to ignore. The wealthy had access to imported creams and private doctors. The poor had corner chemists selling mislabelled poisons. A fine lady's beauty mistake resulted in hushed whispers and a new hat. A working woman's could mean blindness or infection. One London newspaper grimly noted, "Among the poorer classes, many a girl is ruined by the bottle that promised her beauty." Even the simple act of washing was a luxury. Hot water cost coal, soap cost wages. Many working-class homes shared outdoor pumps and tin basins. Some women resorted to cleaning their faces with beer. It was cheaper and, in their defence, disinfecting. Others swore by bread masks, smearing dough on their cheeks to absorb grime overnight. The beauty aisle of the Edwardian poor was the pantry. Meanwhile, the moralists scolded them for trying. Social reformers claimed that factory girls painted their faces to attract improper company. As if makeup and not systemic poverty was the true scandal. The hypocrisy was glaring. Upper-class women applied arsenic-laced creams under the guise of refinement, while working-class women were accused of corruption for using the same ingredients on a smaller budget. Still, the determination persisted. Beauty for the Edwardian poor wasn't about impressing others. It was about pretending, even briefly, that life was softer than it really was. A hint of rouge could disguise malnutrition. A ribbon in the hair could hide the ache of endless labour. The face became a mask, not of deceit, but of hope. Some women even built small cottage industries around this ingenuity. Homemade beauty salves and complexion powders became side hustles sold at markets or door to door. Recipes were copied, improved, and whispered through tenement halls like family heirlooms. 1 spoon of vinegar, 2 drops of courage, as one woman joked, and don't breathe in while it's bubbling. By 1910, the class divide in beauty had become an open secret, one politely ignored by the upper crust and painfully lived by everyone else. The magazines showed ladies in pearls, but the mirror in a worker's flat showed something truer, that beauty in this world was a luxury paid for not just in money, but in risk. The good news, for a brief candle-lit moment she looked radiant. The bad news, the candle was made of tallow, and the glow came from mild chemical burns. Still, in that fleeting reflection, powdered, painted, imperfect, there was pride. And maybe, just maybe, a kind of beauty after all. When it came to beauty, Edwardian men liked to pretend they were above it all. While women suffered through corsets, creams, and occasional electrocution, the gentlemen of the age declared, with the confidence only moustaches can provide, that real men didn't fuss over appearances. And then, once the servants were dismissed and the curtains drawn, they quietly did exactly that. Because of course they did. Edwardian society was built on performance, and men were no exception. Whether you were a politician, an actor, or a banker, your face was your business card, and in an age obsessed with class and refinement, a sagging jawline could sink your career faster than a bad stock tip. So while the ladies were busy smoothing their wrinkles in beauty parlours, the men were sneaking into doctors' offices for medical reasons. Sure, George, your eyebrows needed alignment surgery. The truth was that Edwardian men had their own version of the beauty panic. Industrial life was stressful, public life unforgiving, and the mirror cruelly honest. The pace of modernity, telegraphs, trains, 10-hour workdays and never-ending dinner parties left its mark in furrowed brows and thinning hair. Aging wasn't just a vanity issue, it was a professional liability. A distinguished gentleman was one thing, a tired one, career poison. Of course, male vanity came wrapped in denial. You didn't go to a beauty clinic, you went to a medical specialist. The same treatments women endured for youth were marketed to men as restorative therapies. A facelift became facial reconstruction, a wrinkle treatment became muscular rejuvenation, and a hair transplant, well, that was obviously treatment for scalp fatigue. One London physician offered scientific assistance for men of refinement experiencing premature decline. The brochure featured stern language about vital nerve depletion and the modern gentleman's overtaxed constitution. It never mentioned wrinkles, but every illustration looked suspiciously wrinkle-free. Hair loss was the great masculine crisis of the Edwardian age. The popular pompadour hairstyle, thick, glossy and heroic, demanded an abundant supply of follicles. But nature, ever mischievous, often refused to cooperate. Baldness, the press warned, could make a man appear aged, defeated, or worse, middle management. Enter the era's favourite miracle, the hair transplant. Early experiments were performed by bold doctors in Berlin, Paris, and occasionally the backrooms of London barbershops. The methods range from ingenious to barbaric. Some physicians attempted to graft small strips of skin with follicles still attached, stitching them like patches on a worn carpet. Others opted for hair injection, which involved threading individual strands through the scalp and knotting them underneath. It was equal parts surgery and sewing project. These procedures were, predictably, agonizing. Anesthesia was rare, infection common, and results uneven. Some patients reported new growth, others new regrets, yet desperate men persisted. After all, what was a little blood loss compared to looking perpetually 45? For those unwilling to risk surgery, there was the booming market of hair tonics. Bottles lined chemists' shelves, promising guaranteed regrowth and revitalised scalp activity. Ingredients included alcohol, sulphur, arsenic and optimism. A few worked temporarily by irritating the skin enough to swell the follicles, but most only made users smell like they had been pickled. Wrinkles, too, were a growing male concern. Frown lines were fine if you were a general or a judge, but disastrous for a bachelor hoping to appear youthful. Smooth faces suggested vitality, creased ones implied overthinking, a dangerous look in a society that preferred men to be decisive, not contemplative. Some gentlemen resorted to wrinkle massages, administered by barbers with surprising enthusiasm. Others tried paraffin injections, that same fashionable horror sweeping women's beauty clinics. But because society frowned upon overt vanity, men cloaked their treatments in the language of science and hygiene. Shaving rituals became almost spiritual, hot towels, scented soaps, and meticulous technique. Male grooming manuals of the era were thinly disguised beauty guides, full of advice about complexion, posture, and maintaining youthful alertness. The line between self-care and self-delusion blurred beautifully. Even cosmetics began creeping into masculine respectability. A discreet dab of face powder was acceptable for stage actors and diplomats under bright lights. Moustache wax was practically mandatory. To appear in public with an untrained moustache was an act of social rebellion. Gentlemen used pomades, oils, and creams to tame their facial hair and smooth their skin. They just didn't call it makeup. Class, as ever, shaped everything. The upper class could afford discreet professionals and imported French products. The middle class relied on chemist-brand grooming restoratives, which promised miracles for a few shillings. The working class, they had barber gossip, homemade tonics, and hope. One recipe for gentleman's scalp invigoration, circulated in penny pamphlets. Equal parts gin, pepper, and mustard. It didn't restore hair, but it did restore consciousness when applied too enthusiastically. Behind closed doors, though, even the most powerful men were just as insecure as their powdered counterparts. Politicians fretted about camera lines in early photographs. Clergymen quietly darkened their beards to maintain authority. And actors, the actors, used rouge, mascara, and eyeliner with abandon, pretending it was for theatrical necessity. The Edwardian stage may have been lit by gas lamps, but its leading men glowed suspiciously well. The hypocrisy was astonishing. Men mocked women for vanity while secretly funding entire industries built on their own. One surgeon, in his private notes, confessed that half his male patients insisted their procedures were strictly medical. One, a banker, claimed his facelift was to improve oxygen flow. Another swore his wrinkle removal was to ease the weight of spectacles. Denial apparently was the first anaesthetic. By 1910, male beauty was no longer an open joke. It was a quiet epidemic. Barbershops became sanctuaries for male insecurity, where men could discuss scalp vitality in hushed tones. Gentlemen's clubs even had visiting facial specialists offering electrical invigorations. The official story: they were treating fatigue. The reality: they were trying not to look like their fathers. The Edwardian man's relationship with beauty was as complicated as his starched collar. Tight, restrictive, but impossible to remove. He could never admit to vanity, yet he couldn't escape it either. His world demanded youth, authority, and vigour all at once, a combination that no human face could sustain unaided. So he smoothed, powdered, zapped, and lied just like everyone else. The only difference was vocabulary. Women called it beauty, men called it maintenance. In the end, the Edwardian gentleman's reflection wasn't much different from the ladies'. Polished, composed, and terrified of time. Beneath every waxed moustache and slick of tonic was the same silent fear. That age, like truth, would eventually show, and when it did, he'd say it was for medical reasons. Sure, George, whatever helps you sleep and keep your hair. By the last decade of the Edwardian era, beauty had gone corporate. What began as whispered backroom surgeries and homemade creams extended into a full-blown commercial empire. The Beauty Institute. These grand establishments promised transformation with the authority of medicine and the allure of luxury. Walk through their gilded doors, and you weren't just buying a treatment, you were buying credibility. Unfortunately, most had more gold trim than medical training. From London to Paris, institutes of aesthetic science sprang up faster than respectable excuses for visiting them. They looked nothing like the dingy back alley salons of earlier years. These were temples of elegance, marble foyers, chandeliers that could blind you before the procedure even started, and uniformed attendants who spoke in hushed tones as if escorting you to spiritual enlightenment rather than a facelift. Everything about these places was designed to dazzle and disarm. The moment you stepped inside, the floors gleamed. The air smelled faintly of lavender and ozone, and the receptionist whispered, as though you were entering a confessional. The decor said science, the staff said theatre, the surgeon said trust me, and the typical Beauty Institute menu was a buffet of buzzwords. Rejuvenation, revivification, reconstruction. You could choose from electric skin renewal, paraffin facial sculpture, or oxygenated massage therapy. None of it meant anything, but the terminology was irresistible. The Edwardians loved nothing more than the sound of modernity, especially when it came wrapped in Latin and linen. The staff, however, were a mixed bag. A few genuinely trained physicians, often men on the fringes of the medical community, lent a veneer of legitimacy, but the majority were self-taught practitioners, ex-barbers, or enterprising social climbers who saw opportunity in the public's insecurities. A steady hand with a scalpel was optional, an excellent wardrobe was not. Clients were far more likely to judge a surgeon by his cravat than by his hygiene practices, and yet these institutes flourished. They understood something the early quacks had not. Presentation was half the cure. Patients were far less likely to complain about a botched nose job if the clinic had Corinthian columns and an in-house pianist. Pain, after all, is easier to tolerate under chandeliers. Many establishments even adopted the structure of luxury hotels. Wealthy patrons could book beauty retreats, week-long packages that included meals, treatments, and absolute discretion. Staff addressed clients as Madam or Sir, and referred to surgeries as procedures of repose. There were no operating tables, only comfort couches. Bleeding was rebranded as a natural release of excess vitality. Marketing genius. The Institut Electro-Esthétique in Paris became particularly famous or infamous for blending pseudoscience with opulence. Its founder, Professor Armand Lavoie, claimed to have studied aesthetic medicine in Vienna, though records suggest he studied more wine than anatomy. His salon boasted marble basins, bronze busts of Venus, and a waiting room that looked like the lobby of a small opera house. Clients came from across Europe to have their facial contours harmonized. The results varied between mildly improved and startlingly Picasso. London followed quickly with its own equivalents. Madame Clarice's Institute of Complexion Culture offered scientific wrinkle management and chin correction by vacuum force. The latter involved placing a glass dome over the lower face and pumping out air until the skin pulled tight. Clients left red-faced but hopeful, the Edwardian version of a spa glow. Even the advertisements were masterpieces of manipulation. They borrowed the typography of medical journals, filled with diagrams of facial nerve lines and testimonials signed by Lady A or a noted actress. The message was clear: real science, endorsed by people you wish you were. Of course, behind the velvet drapes and the brass instruments, chaos reigned. Some clinics doubled as social clubs, where gossip flowed freely and surgeons juggled scalpels with champagne glasses. Hygiene was decorative at best. Towels were reused. Instruments occasionally rinsed in perfume rather than alcohol, and assistants were often hired more for appearance than skill. But clients didn't come for safety, they came for status. Attending one of these institutes became a social signal. It meant you were modern, daring, and just vain enough to keep up with the times. Society women bragged in code about visiting my specialist, the way people now brag about their personal trainers. Husbands pretended not to notice when their wives returned from health trips looking mysteriously symmetrical. And then there were the men. By this point, male clients had become a significant portion of the market, though always under the guise of medical necessity. The institutes catered to them with masculine rebranding, the gentleman's clinic for vital restoration. It offered nerve therapy for wrinkles, muscular toning for jawlines, and hair fortification for denial. Financially, the beauty institutes were gold mines. They charged exorbitant fees, justified by the decor, not the results. A single course of rejuvenation could cost as much as a small automobile. The irony: half the clients arrived in taxis because they'd sold their cars to afford it. Yet the lack of oversight made these places breeding grounds for scandal. Lawsuits were hushed up, and failures were buried under layers of powder and propriety. Newspapers occasionally hinted at unfortunate outcomes, but the names of the afflicted were never printed. In a culture obsessed with discretion, silence was the most valuable commodity of all. Still, credit where it's due, the beauty institutes helped shape the modern cosmetic industry. Their emphasis on ambience, packaging, and marketing turned vanity into an experience rather than a transaction. They taught future beauty empires an essential truth. People don't just want results, they want to feel special while being scammed. By the time King Edward VII's reign ended in 1910, London was dotted with aesthetic institutes boasting scientific facades and socialite clients, and though half their treatments belonged in a cautionary textbook, the dream they sold was irresistible. Perfection conveniently located on the ground floor of luxury. In the end, these beauty palaces weren't just selling youth, they were selling reassurance. Every marble column, every gold-trimmed mirror whispered the same comforting lie: you are in capable hands. Of course, the hands in question were often shaky, unqualified, and holding something sharp, but at least they did it in style, because in Edwardian England, looking credible was far more important than being correct, and nothing proved that better than a beauty institute with marble floors, velvet bandages, and absolutely no idea what it was doing. While the Edwardian world was busy powdering, slicing, and electrocuting its way to self-improvement, the medical establishment stood in the corner, clutching its anatomy textbooks and muttering, "What on earth are you people doing?" To the average physician of 1905, the cosmetic surgery craze wasn't progress. It was pandemonium in petticoats. Surgeons who had spent years perfecting life-saving techniques watched in horror as untrained beauty doctors with glittery business cards started wielding scalpels for vanity. The journals called it a disgrace to science, the newspapers called it fashionable, and society predictably called for appointments. The profession's outrage wasn't entirely moral, it was also professional embarrassment. Every infection, every melted nose, every paraffin disaster reflected badly on medicine as a whole. Cosmetic surgery, wrote The Lancet in 1907, belongs to the same branch of healing as astrology to astronomy. Translation: the stars may look the same, but one of these people is guessing. Doctors who took their Hippocratic oath seriously despised the beauty business for treating medicine as theatre. Proper surgery, they argued, was about function, setting bones, mending wounds, saving lives. The cosmetic crowd, on the other hand, was busy restoring noses that worked perfectly well and tightening faces for the sake of gossip page approval. It was, as one physician scoffed, vanity's suicide. And indeed, suicides by vanity were disturbingly literal. Case reports trickled into medical journals describing patients who died from infections, shock, or overdose during so-called minor improvements. Real doctors could do little but sigh as they stitched up the survivors and lectured the rest of society on the perils of self-elective mutilation. The public listened, nodded politely, and immediately booked more appointments. The professional backlash grew fierce. Medical societies debated whether aesthetic operations even counted as ethical practice. One 108 symposium on surgery debated the topic for 6 hours before concluding essentially, "Please stop before someone loses their face again." The respectable press joined in, warning readers that the surgeon's knife, once turned to vanity, becomes a menace to civilization. Strong words, though not quite strong enough to compete with advertisements promising eternal youth. Still, the warnings were memorable. Physicians published fiery essays in journals like the British Medical Journal and Medical Press and Circular describing cosmetic surgery as a moral sickness masquerading as science. They pointed out quite sensibly that most of these procedures had no consistent success rate, no standardized training, and no post-operative care. "A woman may seek beauty," one doctor wrote, "but she will find only suffering." And yet, the irony was that the opposition itself helped popularize the phenomenon. The more doctors warned against it, the more newspapers printed their warnings, next to full-page ads for safe scientific rejuvenation. Fear, as always, made excellent marketing. It didn't help that the medical profession was battling its own credibility issues. Many hospitals were still unhygienic, pain relief inconsistent, and surgery itself a terrifying prospect. To the average Edwardian citizen, the difference between a doctor with a certificate and one with a velvet office was mostly aesthetic. Real medicine had authority. Cosmetic medicine had charm. And in a society addicted to appearances, charm often won. Some physicians tried to take a more pragmatic approach. If people insisted on doing this, they reasoned, better it be done by qualified professionals than by enthusiastic amateurs. A small number of surgeons began cautiously exploring reconstructive techniques, particularly for patients disfigured by burns or accidents. Ironically, these early reconstructive pioneers would one day become the founders of modern plastic surgery. But at the time, they were ridiculed by their peers as face tailors. The debate went beyond the operating table. It became philosophical. Should medicine serve vanity? Could it? Some argued that psychological well-being justified cosmetic intervention. If changing a feature could restore confidence, wasn't that a kind of healing? Others countered that encouraging vanity only deepened neurosis. One letter to the Times dryly concluded, "If one's soul can be lifted by trimming the nose, I shall require several operations myself." Still, many doctors were unflinching in their condemnation. They saw beauty surgery as a betrayal of scientific integrity, a carnival act dressed in antiseptic white. Clinics were mocked as temples of deceit, their practitioners as barbers with delusions of grandeur. One editorial even suggested that anyone offering to improve the face should first be required to improve their handwriting. At least one skill might benefit mankind. Yet beneath the moral outrage lurked a deeper discomfort. Envy. Cosmetic surgeons were making serious money. While general practitioners scraped by treating coughs and stomach ailments, these self-styled artists were charging small fortunes for a single procedure. It didn't take long before some licensed doctors began quietly crossing over, justifying it as bringing order to chaos. In reality, they were bringing their diplomas to the bank, and thus the medical opposition found itself divided, half righteous, half opportunistic. The former thundered against moral decay, the latter saw business potential. By 1910, whispers circulated about respectable surgeons performing rejuvenations for private clients. The very men who had once called cosmetic operations an abomination were now performing them, albeit under pseudonyms and late at night. Still, the official stance remained firm. Real medicine saves lives. It doesn't rearrange them. Publicly, the medical establishment continued to denounce the craze with unrelenting sarcasm. One doctor summed it up neatly during a lecture. When nature errs, she requires correction. When vanity errs, she requires restraint. But perhaps the best commentary came from an anonymous letter published in the Medical Record in 1909. It seems to me, gentlemen, that our age has confused cure with cosmetics. When actual physicians say, maybe don't do that, you should probably listen, or at least wear a helmet. It was the perfect epitaph for Edwardian medicine's relationship with beauty. Equal parts science, sarcasm and exasperation. The doctors could warn, the papers could scold, and the public could nod solemnly. But in the end, the mirror always won, because no matter how stern the warning, nothing frightened an Edwardian more than their own reflection. It is one of history's darker jokes that the science of beauty was perfected through the science of destruction. The Edwardians had been experimenting with vanity surgery in secret salons and marble-floored institutes for years, snipping, slicing, and occasionally setting fire to their own faces in the name of progress. But it wasn't until the world fell apart in 1914 that cosmetic surgery finally became legitimate. Turns out fixing faces for vanity wasn't as noble as fixing faces from shrapnel. When the First World War erupted, the Edwardian obsession with appearances collided with industrial weaponry and lost. The new era of mechanized warfare produced injuries no society had ever seen before. Machine guns, grenades, and artillery didn't just kill, they mangled. Soldiers returned home alive but faceless, their jaws shattered, their noses torn away, their cheeks cratered. The war to end all wars also became the war that invented modern plastic surgery. Before the war, cosmetic procedures had been a shady pursuit, whispered about in drawing rooms, dismissed by doctors as quackery. But suddenly, reconstruction wasn't about vanity, it was about humanity. Thousands of young men who had once been handsome and hopeful came back looking like Picasso sketches come to life. Society couldn't look away, literally and morally, and so medicine had to rise to the challenge. The unlikely hero of this transformation was a New Zealand-born surgeon named Harold Gillies, a man whose pioneering work at Queen's Hospital in Sidcup would change the world's definition of surgery forever. Trained in ear, nose and throat procedures, Gillies was appalled by the severity of facial wounds he encountered in wartime hospitals. Rather than turn away, he turned innovator. He established one of the first specialized reconstructive units, where a team of doctors, artists and dentists collaborated to rebuild soldiers' faces, not to beautify them, but to give them back the ability to eat, speak and live without hiding behind masks, literally. Many early patients wore tin masks painted with their old likenesses to conceal their injuries. Gillies wanted to replace those masks with living skin. The work was brutal, experimental and brilliant. Using techniques like tube pedicle grafts, where skin from one part of the body was rolled into a tube and gradually transplanted elsewhere, Gillies developed methods that allowed new blood flow and minimized infection. His operations could last 12 hours or more, performed in primitive conditions, and were often on patients who had already endured multiple surgeries just to survive. But the results were revolutionary. Men who'd been written off as monsters began to resemble themselves again. Their features weren't perfect, but they were human. And in that transformation lay a quiet kind of heroism. Word of Gillies' miracles spread, and soon other surgeons joined him. The Guinea Pig Club, as some of the wounded jokingly called themselves, became living symbols of modern medicine's power. They were also, inadvertently, the first case studies in large-scale facial reconstruction, each scar a lesson, each success a blueprint for the future of plastic surgery. It was ironic. The same empire that had once scolded women for chasing beauty now poured its resources into restoring it for men broken by war. When vanity met valor, the world suddenly found its sympathy. Surgeons who had once been mocked as face tailors were now national heroes. The difference was purpose. You could call it reconstruction, and suddenly everyone approved. The techniques developed in those field hospitals and rehabilitation centres became the foundation of legitimate plastic surgery. Skin grafting, tissue flaps, cartilage reconstruction, all perfected on soldiers before finding their way back to civilian life. What had once been dismissed as medical heresy now earned lectures, textbooks, and research funding. The beauty doctors of pre-war Edwardian London had been tinkering in parlours. The new surgeons were saving lives in trenches, and yet the psychological aspect of it all was just as profound. Gillies understood that restoring a man's face wasn't merely about tissue, it was about dignity. "It is not enough to make them live," he said. "We must also make them laugh again." Those words could have been engraved above every operating table in Sidcup. In the years that followed, as peace returned and the world tried to clean its wounds, the techniques of wartime surgery quietly drifted back into civilian hands. The line between necessity and desire blurred once more. Doctors who had rebuilt soldiers now found themselves approached by society ladies asking, very politely, whether they could tidy a chin or soften a wrinkle. And so the post-war years gave rise to a new kind of legitimacy for cosmetic surgery, one grounded in medical precision rather than hopeful improvisation. What had begun as a dangerous curiosity under Edwardian chandeliers was now backed by science, skill, and scalpels sterilized for something more than decoration. Still, the irony lingered. The same social forces that had created the Edwardian beauty craze, the fear of aging, the obsession with appearances, survived the war unscathed. Only now they had the blessing of real doctors and real hospitals. Humanity had turned horror into expertise, and expertise into business. But even in the midst of progress, the ghosts of Sidcup remained. The men who endured those early operations were rarely celebrated in drawing rooms. Their reconstructed faces were miracles, yes, but they were also reminders of the price paid for advancement. They were the bridge between vanity and valor, the reason cosmetic surgery could one day be safe, sterile, and almost routine. And so, with scalpels sharpened by war, the modern age of plastic surgery was born, forged not in mirrors but in the trenches. The Edwardians had spent years chasing perfection. The surgeons of the Great War chased something nobler, the restoration of self. And when they found it, the world gained a new kind of beauty, not the powdered porcelain kind, but one defined by endurance, skill and survival. Because in the end, nothing redefined beauty quite like learning to rebuild it from ruin. For all its marble-floored glamour and whispered promises, the Edwardian beauty industry had a dirty secret. It leaked. Behind the silken curtains of discretion lay a world riddled with scandal, lawsuits, and humiliation so spectacular that even the stiffest upper lip couldn't hide it. Every empire built on vanity eventually collapses under the weight of its own mirror, and by 1909 the cracks were showing, quite literally. When enough noses collapsed and chins migrated southward, lawyers began to replace surgeons as the new aesthetic specialists. Imagine getting sued by your chin. It happened more often than you'd think. The Edwardians had been promised transformation, but many instead received trauma, physical, financial, and social. And in a culture obsessed with appearances, nothing spread faster than a ruined face. The first lawsuits trickled quietly through the courts, their details disguised under polite euphemisms. Disfigurement following a private operation, one case read. Facial alteration gone awry, said another. Everyone knew what that meant. Someone had paid to look younger and came out looking like a wax figure left too close to the fire. One particularly famous case involved a society lady of distinction who sued her beauty physician after her paraffin injections hardened into visible lumps along her cheeks. The press, savouring the irony, dubbed her the Marble Woman. Her legal claim argued that her doctor had failed to deliver the promised aesthetic harmony. The defence countered that she simply did not follow post-procedure etiquette. The case settled privately, in other words, with cash and silence, but not every disaster could be hidden. London tabloids quickly discovered that cosmetic surgery scandals sold as well as royal gossip. The Daily Express ran sensational headlines like "Lady disfigured in secret operation" and "Paris beauty doctor flees country." Readers were horrified and enthralled in equal measure. It was moral outrage wrapped in entertainment, the perfect Edwardian cocktail. For the surgeons, reputation was everything. Most beauty doctors operated without licenses, so one public embarrassment could end their careers overnight. That made them desperate and dangerous. Some resorted to blackmail to protect themselves, threatening to expose their wealthy clients if they were sued. After all, what lady of society wanted it printed in the Times that she'd been improved by a man with questionable credentials? There's a recorded incident from 1908 involving a well-known London practitioner who, upon being sued for malpractice, threatened to reveal the names of his aristocratic patrons unless the case was dropped. It worked. The lawsuit vanished, as did the doctor, who reappeared 2 years later in Vienna under a new name, Professor Van Something. Others weren't so lucky. In Paris, one ambitious aesthetic surgeon was dragged to court after a disastrous eyelid operation left a client unable to close her eyes entirely. The newspapers were merciless. "She never blinks now," screamed the headline, as though it were a ghost story instead of a tragedy. The surgeon defended himself by claiming the patient moved at a critical moment. The jury remained unimpressed. Even the elite clinics, those marble-lined temples of modern vanity, couldn't avoid scandal. Their very opulence became a liability. When things went wrong, clients expected perfection, not politesse. One institute in Mayfair was sued after a client's chin refinement left her unable to speak without lisping. The court transcripts were a masterpiece of Edwardian restraint. The plaintiff asserts that certain alterations have impaired articulation. Translation: her chin rebelled. The scandals weren't confined to women either. Men, those self-proclaimed paragons of stoic restraint, also fell victim to botched treatments. One embarrassed gentleman filed a quiet complaint against a Parisian clinic after a scalp restoration turned into what witnesses described as a patchwork resembling wet turf. The clinic offered him a complimentary facial reinvigoration in apology. He declined. But perhaps the most deliciously absurd cases came from the fringes, the quacks and fraudsters who had no business wielding a scalpel in the first place. One, Professor Bellini, whose medical qualifications were entirely imaginary, promised clients nose reshaping without incision. His method: hammering. The lawsuits that followed were swift, justified, and one imagines deeply cathartic. Meanwhile, as lawsuits piled up, so did public fascination. Beauty disasters became cautionary tales whispered at tea parties. Did you hear about Lady Piotr's ears? No, what happened? She tried to have them pinned, and now they whistle in the wind. Every mishap added fuel to society's favourite pastime, moral superiority. Ironically, these very scandals helped cement the industry's survival. Public outrage sparked discussion. Discussion led to regulation, and regulation, however minimal, lent legitimacy. Cosmetic surgery had become too notorious to ignore. If it couldn't be eradicated, it had to be refined. Medical boards began debating the ethics of aesthetic procedures, and legitimate surgeons saw an opportunity to reclaim the field from charlatans. But for every rule written, 10 new loopholes appeared. Shady operators simply moved their clinics across borders or changed the labels on their doors. Beauty doctor became reconstructive specialist. Salon became institute. The patients predictably kept coming. Because scandal, like surgery, has never cured vanity, only made it more discreet. By 1910, the Edwardian beauty craze was entering its final exhausted phase. The lawsuits had stripped away the illusion of safety, but not the desire. The same society that condemned vain women devoured every newspaper column about them. Publicly, the Edwardians tutted about moral decay. Privately, they took notes. The courts may have judged the surgeons, but society judged the victims, often cruelly. A woman who risked surgery and failed was mocked, not pitied. A man who confessed to enhancements was whispered about as eccentric. In the end, shame did what anesthesia could not. It silenced them. Still, the legal chaos served a purpose. Out of all the lies, lawsuits, and lost noses came one undeniable truth. The Edwardians had proven there was money, power, and danger in the business of beauty. The courts couldn't stop it, the doctors couldn't contain it, and the newspapers couldn't resist it. As one weary barrister sighed after yet another cosmetic trial, it appears that people will sue for beauty as readily as they will die for it. And he wasn't wrong, because in Edwardian England, image was everything, and reputation, like a bad nose job, was very hard to fix once it slipped. If the Edwardians had a national sport, it wasn't cricket, it was self-doubt, and no one profited more from that than the beauty advertisers. Somewhere around 1905, marketing executives discovered a new raw material more lucrative than gold or coal: insecurity. They mined it relentlessly, bottled it attractively, and sold it back to the public for 6 shillings a jar. Why love yourself when a 6-shilling ointment can do it for you? Before this revolution, cosmetics were a private matter, whispered about, sold discreetly, and shamefully applied behind closed doors. But as the industrial age flooded cities with posters, print ads, and magazines, the beauty trade discovered the power of visual persuasion. If you could make a woman see her reflection as a problem, you could sell her the solution. Advertisements became psychological warfare printed in elegant cursive. Gone were the vague promises of improvement. Now the message was sharp, personal, and unavoidable. "Do you look older than you feel?" demanded one headline, as if ambushing you in your own bathroom mirror. Another whispered ominously, "A dull complexion may cost you your happiness." The fine print was irrelevant. Panic did the selling. The beauty industry realized something the medical community hadn't. Shame sells better than science. Instead of convincing people their products worked, they convinced them they were broken without them. Every wrinkle was a failure, every freckle a moral flaw, every natural feature an invitation to despair, and it worked spectacularly. Magazines, once filled with society gossip, now featured full-page spreads for youth creams, lip enhancers, and complexion restorers. Each ad followed a precise emotional formula. Identify a flaw you didn't know you had. Exaggerate it until it sounds fatal. Offer salvation in the form of a jar, pill, or electric mask. For example, the Modern Woman's Gazette ran an ad proclaiming, "Lines around the mouth betray more than age. They reveal a troubled soul." The cure? Dr. Montrose's miracle balm made of almond oil, camphor, and unverified optimism. Another featured a drawing of a frowning woman beside the text. She lost her fiancé to another. He preferred a smoother face. It's unclear whether he was real, but the anxiety certainly was. Fake testimonials became an art form. Before I tried Madame Esme's lotion, wrote Miss C of Brighton, my complexion was as lifeless as my social calendar. Now I receive invitations and compliments daily. Miss C was, of course, an invention of the advertising department, along with her newfound social success. Real women might have been too busy working 12-hour days to write glowing letters about their skin. The industry even borrowed the language of science to sound credible. Products boasted chemically tested ingredients, electroactive formulas, and microscopic rejuvenators. None of these terms meant anything, but they sounded impressive enough to justify the price. A little Latin could make anything seem medical. Epiderma revivificans might as well have been bottled hope. One of the cleverest tricks was the use of before and after illustrations. Before featured a grim, tired-looking woman with dishevelled hair. After showed a smiling goddess lit by the glow of capitalism. The drawings were usually exaggerated to the point of caricature, but they worked. In a society that judged worth by appearance, transformation was irresistible, even if it came in the form of graphite lies. Men too were drawn into the marketing web. By 1910, advertisements began targeting the modern gentleman, warning that a dull complexion suggests laziness and that a thinning crown diminishes authority. One tonic even claimed to revitalise the vigour of youth, which is Edwardian code for, we can't say what this really does, but you'll want to believe it. But it wasn't just about selling soap or powder, it was about selling identity. Each product came wrapped in aspiration. A bottle of perfume wasn't a fragrance, it was a social promotion. A face cream wasn't skincare, it was security. The message was relentless. You could be someone new, someone better, someone finally acceptable, if only you bought the right jar. And buy they did. Department stores like Harrods and Selfridges became temples of transformation. Counters overflowed with imported French lotions. American skin rejuvenators and electric beauty devices that promised miracles through mild electrocution. Sales assistants played part psychologist, part priest, diagnosing complexion fatigue with the seriousness of a medical condition. Meanwhile, the advertisements grew bolder. Vogue and the ladies' realm featured glamorous women posed like Greek goddesses, each holding a product as though it were divine nectar. Beneath them, slogans hummed with pseudo-poetry. Youth is fleeting. Hold it gently in your hands with dermal radiance. A woman's best friend is her mirror, but only if she feeds it kindly. Subtlety was not an Edwardian strength. Of course, behind all this glamour was exploitation. The same ads that glorified radiance preyed on women's fear of irrelevance. The Edwardian woman was told she must look youthful to stay desirable, pure to stay respectable, and effortlessly beautiful to prove moral worth. The contradiction was exquisite and profitable. Some critics saw the manipulation clearly. Editorials in The Spectator and The Woman's Signal accused advertisers of creating dissatisfaction for gain. A few reformers even argued for banning medically false claims, though no one could define what counted as false when everyone was selling dreams. Still, the tide was unstoppable. Beauty had become a product, and insecurity its price tag. The ads didn't just reflect social anxiety, they manufactured it, one wrinkle at a time. By 1910, a woman could spend an entire month's wages chasing confidence across a series of bottles. Her dresser became an altar of hope. Cold cream, powder, lotion, tonic, each labelled with the promise that this, finally, would make her enough. And perhaps that was the genius of Edwardian advertising. It didn't sell beauty, it sold relief. The fleeting comfort of believing that control over time, over perception, over worth, came in a neatly packaged jar. It was a simple, devastating equation. Create the fear, then sell the cure. Because in the Edwardian age, self-loathing wasn't just an emotion, it was an industry, and business was booming. By the twilight of the Edwardian era, the greatest lie in beauty was the simplest one: naturalness. Magazines, novels, and polite society praised the woman who needs no artifice, the paragon of effortless grace, the goddess who woke up like this. The irony, she woke up like this because a man named Fenton knocked her out like that. The natural beauty myth wasn't born in honesty, it was born in performance. Society demanded perfection, but condemned anyone who worked too visibly for it. A flawless complexion was admirable, but rouge was scandalous. A delicate nose was desirable, but surgery was shameful. The goal was to appear as though one's beauty had descended straight from heaven, not Harley Street. And so Edwardian women became magicians of deceit. Powder replaced skin, corsets replaced muscle, surgery replaced chance, all while maintaining the polite fiction that one never does anything. The effort to look effortless became a full-time occupation. If self-maintenance had a motto, it would have been, deny everything, admit nothing, glow naturally. The contradiction was maddening. Society demanded that women be both beautiful and innocent of ambition, as if loveliness were a birthright, not an achievement. To admit to using beauty products or medical help was to confess to moral failure. True beauty, wrote the Ladies' Realm in 1908, lies not in paints or powders, but in purity and rest. Easy to say when purity came bottled in arsenic lotion and rest meant a 4-hour face massage at Madame Clarice's Institute. Behind every natural complexion was a small arsenal. Women layered cold creams, bleaches, and complexion waters under the guise of simple hygiene. They kept tiny jars of tinted powder in drawers labelled "for health." Mirrors were strategically placed near windows to catch flattering light. Even hairstyles were constructed to disguise surgical tweaks. Bangs hid forehead scars. Ribbons softened jawlines. Veils obscured chemical burns. And when surgery entered the picture, secrecy reached new levels. Women who had undergone facelifts or nose corrections would swear they had merely rested at a spa. One lady famously attributed her smoother face to sea air. The only sea she'd encountered was the sterile basin used to rinse her bandages. The social hypocrisy was staggering. Men lauded the unspoiled woman, unaware that the unspoiled look cost half a year's wages, multiple chemical burns, and a small fortune in imported French creams. Meanwhile, actresses and socialites who publicly denied surgery were quietly funding its expansion. They sold the fantasy of naturalness to a public desperate to believe it was attainable, or at least purchasable. The stage and early cinema amplified this illusion. Edwardian theatre stars were the influences of their day, and the camera was merciless. The newly emerging film industry demanded youth and symmetry that reality could not provide. Actresses learned quickly that natural beauty on screen required unnatural effort. Under the glare of studio lights, natural skin turned ghostly. Untouched faces required layers of powder and rouge just to look alive. Yet in interviews, these same stars swore by fresh air and good temper. One such celebrity, the London actress Vera Allendale, was rumoured to have undergone one of the earliest successful facelifts. When asked how she maintained her radiant youth, she smiled and said, "A cheerful heart, my dear." Perhaps true, if Cheerful Heart was the name of her surgeon's yacht in the south of France. Men, of course, were no less hypocritical. They demanded women be natural, then punished those who were. A woman who wore makeup was vain. One who didn't was unkempt. A woman who aged gracefully was dignified, provided she somehow still looked 28. The entire game was rigged, an endless, exhausting performance in which sincerity was the one unforgivable flaw. The natural beauty myth also had a moral dimension. Artificiality was coded as deceit, while naturalness was equated with virtue. Advertisers exploited them mercilessly, claiming their products enhanced nature rather than replaced it. The creams promised to restore what time had stolen, as though buying back lost youth were a matter of good housekeeping. Even language played its part. Women no longer painted their faces, they refreshed them. They didn't dye their hair, they revitalised it. A nose job wasn't surgery, it was corrective balance. Edwardian beauty was an elaborate exercise in euphemism, where denial was the truest cosmetic of all. But beneath the politeness, anxiety simmered. The myth of effortless perfection forced women into impossible competition, not just with each other, but with the fantasy versions of themselves reflected in advertisements. Every morning the mirror became an adversary. Why can't I look natural? Wasn't a question, it was a daily defeat. Worse still, the burden of maintenance fell entirely on women. Society celebrated their beauty but despised the labour it took to maintain it. A man's wrinkles made him wise, a woman's made her disposable. A man's distinguished greying was charming, a woman's was tragic. Thus, even those who embraced the natural ideal did so out of fear. Fear of ridicule, of irrelevance, of becoming invisible. There were a few who rebelled. Suffragettes, artists and intellectuals began rejecting the myth, calling it a form of social control. They tell us to be natural, one activist wrote in The Free Woman, but only into ways that please men. The rebellion was subtle, looser hair, simpler dress, unapologetic age, but radical in meaning. Refusing to perform natural beauty was, in itself, a declaration of independence. Still, the myth persisted. It was too profitable, too comforting, too cleverly constructed to die. It promised women that they could achieve perfection without effort, a lie that spared men discomfort and spared advertisers no expense. The most successful beauty campaigns of the 1910s were those that whispered, "Be yourself, just better." By the end of the Edwardian era, natural beauty had become the ultimate performance. It was the illusion that sustained an entire industry, one that punished women for pretending and punished them even more for not pretending well enough. So the next time you see a portrait of a glowing Edwardian lady, her cheeks gently blushed, her skin smooth as cream, and her expression effortlessly serene, remember she didn't wake up like that. She woke up stitched, powdered, possibly electrified, and very determined not to tell you about it. Because in Edwardian England, the only thing more unnatural than the pursuit of beauty was pretending it was natural. The Edwardian era may have been fading into the sepia tones of history, but its beauty secrets refused to fade with it. Even as science advanced, as new creams and surgeries promised miracles, one thing remained stubbornly constant: silence. Nobody talked about it. Not openly, not honestly. To admit to having work done was social suicide, a confession that one had meddled with the divine order of things. You could be caught poisoning your complexion with lead, bleaching your hair with ammonia, or even slightly setting yourself on fire in pursuit of youth. But God forbid anyone found out you'd been under the knife. This was, after all, the golden age of polite hypocrisy. Everyone knew someone who had gone away for her nerves and returned with a smoother face. Everyone pretended not to notice. Beauty in Edwardian society was a communal lie, sustained by powder, propriety, and an astonishing commitment to denial. The social rules were maddeningly specific. If you improved your looks, you were expected to claim credit for fresh air, or a restful fortnight by the sea. If your face looked suspiciously lifted, you might say, "I've been sleeping better." And if half your nose had clearly been remoulded, "Sinus troubles, dear, the doctor insisted." The Edwardians invented the humble brag before it had a name. "Oh, my complexion? Just soap, prayer and chloroform." It wasn't that cosmetic surgery had disappeared, and quite the opposite. By the 1910s there were more procedures than ever, but they had migrated underground once more, slipping quietly beneath the surface of respectability. The women who could afford such transformations were also the ones most desperate to hide them. A wrinkle-free face was a trophy to be admired, but never discussed, like a scandalous lover in Paris. In social circles, whispers replaced conversation. Dinner parties buzzed with speculation disguised as sympathy. "Poor Mrs. B. She hasn't looked herself lately," someone might murmur. "Yes," another would reply knowingly, "but at least she looks." Gossip was both weapon and entertainment. The line between curiosity and cruelty blurred deliciously. For women, the stakes were painfully high. To admit to surgery was to risk being branded as vain, deceitful, or, worst of all, modern. Respectable womanhood was built on the illusion of effortlessness. Nature, society insisted, should never look improved, yet paradoxically, failing to maintain one's looks was just as shameful. There was no winning, only strategic lying. Magazines fed this duplicity with conflicting advice. One issue might publish a sermon on the dangers of vanity. The next would quietly run an advertisement for painless facial correction. The message was clear: you may cheat nature, but only if you do it quietly and look repentant afterward. The social hierarchy of surgery became just as rigid as that of class. The wealthy could hide their operations behind travel and privacy. The middle classes, though ever eager to imitate, took greater risks with cheaper, less discreet practitioners. Working women, meanwhile, could only dream of such luxuries, forced instead to chase respectability through powders and potions that promised miracles for a shilling. The aftermath of the beauty craze also produced a peculiar kind of survivor's guilt. Many who had undergone dangerous procedures now bore the scars, physical and emotional, of their vanity. Yet they could never speak of it. Society rewarded the illusion, not the truth. Women whose surgeries succeeded became paragons of natural beauty. Those whose surgeries failed became cautionary tales, proof that one should never tamper with God's handiwork. It was a cruel double standard. Success was divine, failure, Sobelia, was deserved. Men, for their key part, handled the topic with characteristic hypocrisy. They mocked women for artificiality while quietly patronising the same clinics themselves. But unlike women, they could frame their procedures as medical necessity. A man with a hair transplant had addressed a scalp disorder. A man with a smooth jawline had corrected a strain from fencing. In short, they cheated better and bragged less. As for the surgeons, they lived in a moral no-man's land. Publicly, they insisted their work was reconstructive, necessary, dignified, and entirely medical. Privately, they knew half their clients were simply bored duchesses with too much time and too many mirrors. Still, discretion paid handsomely, and the surgeons who kept secrets best became the most sought after. Their reputations grew precisely because they never discussed them. But not everyone played along. The suffragettes, ever the disruptors, began attacking beauty culture as a tool of control. "They would rather we polish our faces than our minds," one activist declared in 1911. To them, the lingering shame around surgery was part of a broader system that kept women dependent, punished for wanting to look good, punished for not looking good enough. Beauty, they argued, was just another cage gilded with compliments. Yet even they weren't immune to society's gaze. The unadorned woman was derided in newspapers as unfeminine or bitter. If the polished woman was vain, the plain woman was militant. The Edwardians excelled at inventing no-win scenarios. By the end of the era, a strange equilibrium had emerged. Surgery remained scandalous but normalised. Everyone disapproved of it, and everyone quietly did it. It became an open secret, much like adultery or imported champagne, a sin so common that it ceased to shock. Still, the stigma lingered. Women practiced new skills, perfecting the art of denial, developing strategic laughter when someone mentioned beauty improvements, and cultivating the right balance of outrage and innocence when gossip struck too close. Surgery, they'd gasp, "Oh, heavens no, I've simply been drinking more milk." And society, ever complicit, nodded approvingly. Because the Edwardian illusion wasn't about truth, it was about maintenance. Keeping up appearances, both literally and socially, was the highest form of etiquette. In the drawing rooms and parlours of post-Edwardian England, everyone knew who had been adjusted, but politeness dictated silence. Scandal lived in whispers, and so did sympathy. The mirror, as always, kept its secrets. The irony was poetic. The same society that demanded flawless beauty was also the one that demanded shame for achieving it. But perhaps that was the Edwardian genius all along, to make women perform miracles in private, then blush in public when anyone noticed. After all, in a world obsessed with appearances, the only unforgivable thing was admitting how much effort it took to look effortless. When the cannons began to thunder in 1914, the Edwardian beauty craze finally met its match, not in moral reform, not in medical scandal, but in war. It turns out that when the world is on fire, people stop worrying about their pores. Beauty went on hiatus. Mud and gas masks weren't great for contouring. For over a decade, Britain and its glittering peers had been obsessed with the pursuit of perfection. Faces lifted, noses refined, and insecurities bottled and sold. Then, almost overnight, the same women who once spent mornings massaging cold cream into their cheeks were lining up at munitions factories, sewing uniforms and managing ration cards. The world didn't care how youthful you looked, only that you could endure. The First World War bulldozed the Edwardian illusion of leisure. Powder compacts were traded for factory gloves, satin gowns for khaki overalls. Social hierarchies, once so rigid, began to dissolve under the shared pressure of survival. Vanity didn't vanish entirely, and it simply became impractical. Rouge clashed with gas masks, and perfume was hard to justify when soap itself was rationed. The glossy pages of pre-war magazines suddenly looked obscene. Issues of the Ladies' Realm or Vogue from 1913, filled with advertisements for chin refinement and complexion radiance, were now relics of an impossible dream. By 1915, the tone had shifted dramatically. The new beauty ideal wasn't about elegance, it was about resilience. Keep a brave face, urged one women's column, meant metaphorically, but also literally, since smiling through exhaustion was now considered patriotic. Another headline declared, "Pretty faces help win the war some," suggesting that morale, like rouge, could be applied in layers. The absurdity didn't go unnoticed, but even propaganda knew that vanity, once awakened, never truly sleeps. Still, the old kind of beauty, the gilded, indulgent, self-sculpting kind, was gone. Wartime Britain had no patience for frivolity. Women now worked 12-hour shifts in munitions factories, their faces smeared with yellow dust from explosive chemicals. The press called them canary girls for their sickly glow, a tragic parody of the Edwardian quest for luminosity. If the Edwardians had once chased the perfect complexion, these women were literally glowing, with toxins. And yet, there was an unintentional poetry to it. For the first time, beauty was replaced by purpose. Women found strength in grit, camaraderie, and necessity, all things that could not be powdered on. The mirror lost its tyranny for a while. Nobody had time for self-loathing when survival was the new aesthetic. Meanwhile, the men who had once judged women's looks were now coming home from the front unrecognisable. Scarred, broken, their own faces rewritten by war. The same society that once worshipped symmetry now confronted its fragility. Surgeon Harold Gillies and his colleagues, working tirelessly to reconstruct soldiers' faces, unintentionally gave birth to real plastic surgery, not as vanity, but as restoration. The mirror, for the first time, reflected courage instead of cosmetics. War also changed how beauty was talked about. The rhetoric of transformation took on a darker tone. Reconstruction, once the language of salons, now described hospitals. Restoration, once a euphemism for anti-aging, became a mission of mercy. Even the word makeover began to feel hollow when the very landscape of Europe was being torn apart. For society at large, priorities inverted. The Edwardian obsession with leisure gave way to utility. Fashion simplified. Silhouettes loosened. Corsets were declared unpatriotic. Metal was needed for bullets, not bus lines. Makeup, when worn, became subdued, a faint trace of colour to suggest vitality rather than vanity. Powder was still applied, but now to conceal fatigue instead of flaunt glamour. Men returning from the front looked at the world, and its women, differently. The innocence of pre-war beauty culture seemed grotesque beside the horrors they'd seen. The woman painted like a porcelain doll was replaced by the woman who could drive an ambulance, nurse the wounded, or manage a business. The definition of attractive shifted from soft fragility to quiet strength. Of course, not everyone surrendered their vanity willingly. Even in wartime, small rebellions persisted. Women painted their lips with beet juice when cosmetics ran out, used soot to darken lashes. An improvised hair tonic from kitchen oils. These weren't acts of indulgence, they were defiance. A reminder that even amid chaos, self-expression refused to die. Still, for every lipstick smuggled into a barracks, there were hundreds of faces that went bare, not from choice but from necessity. The endless rush of work, rationing and grief made grooming a distant memory. Beauty became something nostalgic, a luxury remembered in quiet moments between air raids. The industries that had once thrived on insecurity collapsed almost overnight. Beauty institutes closed, their gilt-frame mirrors gathering dust. The surgeons who had once shaped noses for debutantes now patched together the faces of soldiers. Advertisers pivoted from youth creams to comforting hand lotions for war work. Even vanity learned how to serve the empire. By 1917, no one spoke of the Edwardian beauty craze in the past tense. It felt like another world entirely. The champagne, the parasols, the idle gossip about cheekbones, all of it had drowned in mud and smoke. The war didn't just end an era, it exposed its absurdity. And yet, when peace finally came, the hunger for beauty returned. Tempered, redefined, but still alive. The women who had laboured through war wanted to celebrate their survival. They had earned the right to adorn themselves again, not out of vanity, but victory. When lipstick made its grand post-war comeback, it wasn't frivolous. It was defiance painted in red. The Edwardian age of excess had collapsed under the weight of global tragedy, but its legacy endured. The obsession with appearance had merely been paused, not erased. The mirror, patiently waiting in the shadows, would soon beckon again. But for a few brief years, the world learned something extraordinary. That beauty could exist without embellishment. In courage, endurance, and the simple act of continuing to live. Because when the bombs fell and the powders ran out, the prettiest thing in Britain was survival. When the powdered smoke of the Edwardian era cleared, it left behind more than lace fans and scandalous gossip. It left an entire industry. What had begun as whispered vanity under gaslight had, by the 20th century, hardened into science, business, and cultural obsession. Those trembling scalpels wielded in drawing rooms and beauty institutes were the clumsy ancestors of modern cosmetic surgery. The risks were reduced, the tools refined, but the motive, as eternal as the mirror. We may have better lighting and anesthesia now, but the same old question remains. Do I look younger yet? The Edwardians would have been horrified and secretly thrilled to see how their dangerous little indulgence became a global enterprise. What they began as scandal, we rebranded as self-care. What they called vanity, we now call confidence, but strip away the modern marketing and the ring lights, and it's the same human impulse. The desperate wish to edit the body into harmony with the ideal. The Great War, ironically, legitimized the craft. The surgeons who had once been mocked for meddling with nature emerged from the trenches as heroes, armed with new techniques for rebuilding faces torn apart by shellfire. Harold Gillies, the pioneer of reconstructive surgery, had proved that science could restore not just flesh, but dignity. And as peace returned, his students, and their students, quietly carried those lessons back into peacetime society. In the 1920s, the line between reconstruction and cosmetic enhancement began to blur again. Only now it came with medical credentials. clinics opened with real sterilisation, real anesthesia, and, perhaps most importantly, real billing departments. What had once been a furtive indulgence for socialites became a legitimate, if expensive, form of self-improvement. The same techniques developed to rebuild war wounds were adapted for aesthetic use. Skin grafts became facelifts. Nasal reconstructions turned into nose refinements. The term plastic surgery, from the Greek plastikos, meaning to mould, entered the public lexicon not through vanity, but valour. But vanity was quick to follow. Humanity, having learned how to heal, immediately began using that power to chase perfection again. By the mid-20th century, cosmetic surgery had gone global. In America, Hollywood accelerated the trend. Film demanded flawless faces, and audiences demanded to believe those faces were real. Movie stars, the modern descendants of Edwardian actresses, visited discreet surgeons between films. The natural beauty myth was reborn under studio lights, this time with better PR departments. Meanwhile, in Europe, the old Edwardian ghost persisted, the shame, the secrecy, the moral debate. Newspapers printed cautious articles titled "Science and Beauty, a Marriage of Necessity," while quietly interviewing surgeons who had months-long waiting lists. Even as medicine advanced, modesty lagged behind. Admitting to surgery remained taboo, but everyone recognised it when they saw it. The irony was timeless. Society praised the results and condemned the effort. What changed most dramatically was accessibility. Once reserved for aristocrats and actresses, cosmetic surgery slowly democratised. By the 1960s, it was no longer the exclusive domain of duchesses and dowagers. Middle-class women could now finance a nose or a lift just as easily as a holiday. The Edwardian beauty clinics, all gilt mirrors and unqualified optimism, had evolved into sterile, chrome-lit offices with certificates on the walls and payment plans in the drawers. The technology advanced too. Out went paraffin injections and mysterious electrical rejuvenators. In came safer anesthesia, antibiotics, and eventually lasers. Yet the core anxiety remained identical: time and how to trick it. And in a sense, every Botox needle and filler vial today is the distant descendant of an Edwardian dream, the fantasy that one can rewrite the body's story. Back then, a woman risked infection for smoother skin. Now, she risks overdoing her refresh. Progress, as usual, comes with side effects. But the legacy of Edwardian surgery isn't just medical, it's cultural. That era created the blueprint for modern beauty culture, the marketing of self-dissatisfaction, the promise of transformation, the illusion of effortlessness. The Edwardians invented the paradox we still live with, that self-acceptance must be purchased, preferably in monthly installments. Their beauty institutes were the ancestors of today's med spas. Their miracle creams evolved into anti-aging serums with unpronounceable ingredients. Their social gossip became our celebrity tabloids and Instagram comment sections. Every influencer unboxing a rejuvenation serum owes a quiet debt to Madame Clarice and her Edwardian colleagues, who once sold facial harmony to women afraid of fading in candlelight. Even the moral panic has endured. Just as Edwardian doctors denounced cosmetic surgery as vanity suicide, modern critics lament its psychological cost. Only the vocabulary has changed. Self-image instead of moral decay, unrealistic standards instead of fallen virtue. The battle between self-expression and self-erasure is as old as the scalpel itself. And yet, the Edwardians did give us something valuable, unintentionally. Their mistakes forced progress. Their infections birthed antiseptics. Their scandals led to regulation. Their tragedies inspired legitimate medical research. Without their reckless experimentation, plastic surgery might still be confined to battlefield medicine. Their vanity, in its strange way, built the foundation for compassion, the power to restore what time or trauma destroys. Today, the industry they unknowingly founded is worth hundreds of billions, spanning everything from Botox lunches to full facial reconstructions. The techniques once pioneered to disguise aging duchesses are now used to help burn victims, accident survivors, and transgender individuals find peace in their own skin. The mirror that once enslaved has, in some cases, liberated. Of course, the paradox persists. We still chase youth with the same feverish devotion the Edwardians once hid behind lace veils. The products sparkle, the surgeons smile, and the question remains eternal, whispered across centuries, through every powdered cheek and glowing screen. Do I look younger yet? The Edwardians would recognise the anxiety instantly, though they might marvel at the lighting, and they'd probably approve of the anesthesia, a definite improvement on bite down and hope for the best. Their legacy then is twofold: progress and proof. Progress in the science of healing, and proof that no matter how civilized we become, our reflection will always be our most relentless critic. So yes, we have fewer scars now, fewer infections, and infinitely better pain management. But the ghost of Edwardian vanity still lingers in every selfie, every touch-up, every whispered confession that someone has had a bit of work. The tools have changed, the fear hasn't. Because even in the age of lasers and filters, beauty remains what it was in the candlelit salons of 1905. A dangerous negotiation between who we are, who we want to be, and what we're willing to risk in between.